Plankton may be known for failing to steal the Krabby Patty formula, but his criminal history goes far beyond a few failed plans. Over the years, he has brainwashed citizens, taken control of Bikini Bottom, committed fraud, sabotage, and betrayed those closest to him. In this video, we break down every crime Plankton has ever committed. Section 1. The First Night. Sheldon James Plankton was introduced to the world on July 31st, 1999, inside a Krabby Patty. Not metaphorically, physically. The first time audiences ever saw him, a Krabby Patty was moving across the floor of the Krusty Krab under its own power, sliding toward the front door in a way that looked, to SpongeBob, like a ghost. Mr. Krabs reached down, lifted the patty, and there was Plankton underneath it, clinging to the bottom, straining with everything his microscopic body had. That was the introduction. One tiny organism, the full weight of a fast food burger on his back, caught before he even made it out the door. Mr. Krabs flicked him back to the chum bucket without much ceremony. The whole thing lasted seconds. And for anyone watching that first episode of SpongeBob SquarePants who thought that was the end of it, the second half of the episode existed to correct that assumption. What followed in that debut appearance was something that television had not quite seen before in a children's cartoon villain. Plankton did not retreat. He did not plot from a distance. He walked across the street, found SpongeBob, pretended to be his friend, and when that failed, he broke into SpongeBob's skull while the sponge was sleeping and hijacked his brain. All of this happened within a single 11-minute episode. The show was establishing something from the very beginning. Plankton had no floor. There was no crime he considered off the table. The only question, every time, was which approach he would try first. Before getting to what happened inside that skull, the friendship attempt deserves its own space, because it is one of the purest examples of social engineering in the show's entire run. After being ejected from the Krusty Krab, Plankton waited outside for SpongeBob and approached him as a peer. He told SpongeBob that the two of them were friends. He had constructed a story to support this. It was, he claimed, his birthday the following day. Friends give each other gifts on birthdays. What he wanted as a birthday gift was a Krabby Patty. The whole construction took maybe a minute of screen time, but it contained every element that would define Plankton's social manipulation across the entire series. A false claim of connection, a manufactured reason for the target to feel obligated, a specific ask dressed up as an emotional appeal. SpongeBob refused. The refusal was immediate and clear. He told Plankton directly that he would never hand over a Krabby Patty, and he went home. But Plankton had already made a promise to himself that SpongeBob would deliver one personally. The promise was made out loud, to SpongeBob's retreating back, which tells you something about how seriously Plankton takes the idea of an audience, even when no one useful is listening. He performs his confidence, even when nobody who matters is watching. That quality, the villain who declares victory before the plan has started, would remain one of his most consistent traits across every season that followed. That night, after the Krusty Krab had closed and SpongeBob had gone to sleep, Plankton entered through a pore in SpongeBob's skin. He navigated the internal architecture of a sleeping sponge, made his way to the brain, and attached a device he had built for exactly this purpose. The device was labeled Total Control on its casing. It had 2 toggles and a red button in the center. Plankton pressed the button, and SpongeBob's body stood up from bed and began moving under someone else's direction. What happened next is worth describing carefully, because it is easy to let the comedy of the sequence make the crime feel smaller than it is. Plankton, inside another living creature's head, physically controlling that creature's movements against its will, marched SpongeBob out of his house and through the neighborhood. SpongeBob was conscious during this. He was aware of what was happening. He could think and speak, but he could not stop his own limbs. He passed through Squidward's house, disrupting his neighbor's evening in a way that caused Squidward visible distress. He was then walked past Patrick's Rock, through the night streets of Bikini Bottom, and directly into the Krusty Krab. Inside the restaurant, under Plankton's control, SpongeBob's hands took a Krabby Patty from the kitchen. Then Plankton marched him across the street to the chum bucket. The entire journey happened while SpongeBob was aware and present in his own mind, unable to redirect or stop himself, carrying stolen property at the direction of someone who had entered his body without permission and would not leave. At the chum bucket, Plankton showed SpongeBob his lab and what he had built inside it. The analyzer was a machine designed to break down any food item placed into it and identify its ingredients. A piece of seaweed went in and came back as 50% sea, 50% weed. The Krabby Patty was going to go in next. Whatever came out of that analysis would have given Plankton the formula. And whatever the formula was worth to him, it was enough to justify everything he had just done to get to this moment. The theft, the trespass, the invasion, the hijacking, all of it was, in Plankton's accounting, a reasonable price for what that readout would have given him. SpongeBob bought time by singing. He began a long, slow tribute to the Krabby Patty, describing it in terms that were heartfelt and slightly unhinged, a declaration of love for a burger that had the effect of keeping the burger out of the machine while Plankton grew increasingly frustrated. The delay mattered because Plankton, still inside SpongeBob's skull, eventually made the mistake of wanting to taste the thing he had come all this way to analyze. He leaped out of SpongeBob's head toward the Krabby Patty, missed, hit the surface of the analyzer, and bounced directly into the machine. The machine identified him. His data was processed. He was trapped on the other side of the screen, looking out from inside a computer, shouting for SpongeBob to bring back the patty while SpongeBob walked home with it under his arm, no longer under anyone's control. That is how the first episode ended. Plankton locked in his own machine, SpongeBob walking home with the Krabby Patty intact. The crimes committed in that single episode were attempted theft during business hours, social manipulation through a fabricated pretext, unlawful entry into a private residence, unauthorized entry into a living person's body, installation of a control device on a living brain without consent, forced physical labor under involuntary control, criminal trespass through the Krusty Krab after hours, and theft of a Krabby Patty carried out by a victim who could not stop himself. All of this happened before the show's third episode had finished airing. That was the opening statement. Everything that came after built on the foundation those 11 minutes established. The voice behind Plankton in that first episode, and in every episode since, belongs to Doug Lawrence, who performs under the professional name Mr. Lawrence. Lawrence is not just the voice of the character. He has been one of the show's writers since the early seasons, contributing to the scripts that send Plankton out on his various missions. He won the role through an audition contest held at the beginning of production, and has described the voice as something that arrived fully formed once he understood who the character was. The sound is high-pitched, irritable, quick to shift between certainty and rage, and it carries a specific quality of someone who believes completely in his own intelligence while simultaneously being stopped by a patty, a pour, and a machine he built himself. That gap between the voice and the result is part of what makes every scene land. Stephen Hillenburg created Plankton as a recurring antagonist for Mr. Krabs, a business rival whose ambitions dwarfed his physical size in every direction. The original plan, according to accounts of the show's early development, was for Plankton to appear less frequently than he eventually did. The character proved too dramatically useful and too reliably funny to limit. His size was part of what made him simultaneously threatening and absurd. A giant villain plotting to destroy a city is frightening in a conventional way. A villain smaller than a thumbnail plotting to steal a sandwich recipe and then rule the world is something stranger and more interesting. Hillenburg understood that the gap between Plankton's self-image and his actual physical presence was its own engine of comedy, and that the crimes themselves became funnier the more completely Plankton committed to them. He never half-heartedly attempted anything. Whatever the scheme was, he was all the way in. The Chum Bucket, which sits directly across the road from the Krusty Krab, had been a complete commercial failure from the beginning. No customers came in. The food was made from chum, which is fish bait, and it was considered more or less inedible by everyone in Bikini Bottom. The restaurant existed as a monument to Plankton's ambition and as a daily, visible reminder of how far that ambition had failed to carry him. Every day he looked out his window and saw the Krusty Krab doing steady business on the other side of the road. Every day the distance between his situation and Mr. Krab's situation felt like a verdict delivered personally against him. The formula, to Plankton, was never just a recipe. Getting it meant that his methods were correct, that his intelligence was sufficient, that whatever had gone wrong could be corrected and the gap closed and the score finally settled. The Krabby Patty represented proof of something he needed to believe about himself. This is why the attempts never stopped, even after hundreds of documented failures, and why each new scheme carried the same total investment that the first one did. The first episode made all of that clear. It also made clear that the crimes would never be small. There is something worth sitting with regarding that mind control device specifically. It was not improvised. Plankton built it in advance, which means he had already planned to use it on someone before that episode began. The device had a machined casing. It had labeled controls. It had a specific function that required engineering, design, testing, and preparation. Breaking into SpongeBob's skull was not a spur-of-the-moment decision made after the birthday gambit failed. It was the backup plan, already constructed and sitting in the Chum Bucket lab, ready to be deployed the moment the social manipulation failed to produce results. Plankton had thought this through before the episode started. He had built a brain control machine, in advance, intended for use on a neighbor who had done nothing to him. That is premeditated neurological assault, prepared and executed with calm technical precision. The episode never pauses to name what that is. It does not need to. The device speaks for itself. The question of how Plankton even knew the backup plan would be necessary is worth a moment. He approached SpongeBob with a fabricated story, which suggests he already understood that the honest approach, walking up to the fry cook and simply asking for the formula, would fail. He was right, but his preparation of the brain device before the conversation even took place suggests he did not truly believe the manipulation would work either. The social engineering was not a plan he expected to succeed. It was a delay tactic, or perhaps an experiment, while his actual plan waited in the lab. He was never really trying to make friends with SpongeBob that evening. He was buying time before he was ready to move. After the events of that first episode, Plankton's presence in the show settled into a recurring structure. He would appear, scheme with total commitment, come genuinely close to success through various means, and then fail at the last moment, through some combination of his own overconfidence and SpongeBob's inadvertent interference. The pattern was not random. It was written that way deliberately. partly because the show's ongoing premise required the Krusty Krab to keep operating, and partly because Plankton's specific value as a character required that he never fully win in the series proper. His victories, when they occasionally came, were temporary. His failures were complete. And the failures never broke him, because the alternative was accepting that he had lost permanently, and that was something he was constitutionally unable to process. The criminal record that begins with that first night, the patty under the burger in broad restaurant light, the fake birthday story on the street, the mind control device, and the long, involuntary walk through sleeping Bikini Bottom is the foundation on which the entire case file was built. Every scheme that came after it was an extension of what the show declared on July 31st, 1999. Plankton would do anything. He would cross any line, enter any body, deploy any technology. He had both the means and the willingness in full. The only thing that ever stopped him, in that debut and in almost every episode that followed, was the specific and inexhaustible resilience of a fry cook who turned out to be much harder to fully control than a brain-sized device should have made possible. That debut also set the geography that defined Plankton's entire criminal operation. The Chum Bucket and the Krusty Krab sit directly across from each other, and the road between them functions as the border of Plankton's entire world. Almost every crime he ever committed began on one side of that road and was aimed at the other. He crossed it on foot, in robots, in disguise, through the sewer system, inside the bodies of other people, through the phone lines, and through the dreams of sleeping residents. The road never got any wider. The target never moved. And for more than 25 years of television, Plankton kept crossing it, in one form or another, carrying whatever new device or deception he had assembled since the last time he failed. What the first episode gave the audience was not just a villain. It gave them a villain whose crimes were inventive enough to stay surprising, and whose commitment to those crimes was complete enough to stay funny. Plankton never apologized for what he did. He never expressed remorse, never reconsidered his methods based on ethics, never paused to weigh the harm against the reward. In that debut episode, he entered a living creature's brain in the middle of the night and drove it across town to steal food. And when it fell apart at the end, his only complaint was that SpongeBob should bring back the patty. That total absence of second-guessing is the engine of every crime that follows. It is also what makes Plankton, in his way, one of the most purely committed characters in the history of the form. He means it every time. He has always meant it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up is the wave of schemes that introduces a new kind of crime, the long con, where the target is SpongeBob's trust and the weapon is friendship itself. Section 2. The long con. Manipulation was always Plankton's second language. He spoke it fluently, without accent, and he returned to it whenever the direct approach had failed. After the brain device and the night walk through Bikini Bottom, the next phase of his criminal career moved away from technology and toward something quieter and more patient. 2 crimes in the early seasons involved no robots, no machines, and no forced entry into anyone's body. Both of them worked by making someone trust him. Both of them reveal something about how Plankton thought about the people around him. Not as obstacles to be forced aside, but as instruments to be played when the moment called for a softer touch. The first of these was the scheme built around SpongeBob's most fundamental character trait, his need to believe that friendship is possible with anyone. Season 1's 10th episode placed Plankton at the center of a plot that required him to do something genuinely difficult. Spend time with SpongeBob voluntarily, behave warmly enough to pass as a friend, and maintain that performance long enough to get close to a Krabby Patty. The episode began with another failed theft attempt at the Krusty Krab, one that triggered the restaurant's full security lockdown, sealed the windows with steel shutters, and sent Plankton running with his laser-blasted escape route closing behind him. SpongeBob recovered the patty. The town cheered. Plankton walked home alone, and for just a moment the show let that image breathe, a small green organism trudging back across the road while the noise of the celebration faded behind him. SpongeBob noticed. He felt sorry for Plankton in a way that was characteristically uncomplicated. Plankton seemed lonely. SpongeBob decided to be his friend. This was not a plan Plankton had executed. SpongeBob walked into it on his own, propelled entirely by his own kindness. Plankton, when Karen pointed out that this was an opportunity to use SpongeBob to get closer to the formula, accepted immediately and without visible conflict. Whatever brief moment of genuine contact the opening scene might have suggested was replaced, in Plankton's internal accounting, with a tactical decision. He would be SpongeBob's friend. He would be good enough at it to get what he needed. The friendship that followed involved jellyfishing at Jellyfish Fields, which Plankton agreed to attend while describing the outing to himself as a means to an end. What happened at Jellyfish Fields is one of the more genuinely complicated moments in Plankton's early characterization. He did, by several accounts in the episode itself, appear to be having fun. He sang the song SpongeBob taught him. He laughed. Karen later had to remind him, explicitly, that he was not supposed to be enjoying himself. He was supposed to be working. The fact that Karen needed to issue that reminder suggests that for a window, however brief, Plankton had drifted away from the scheme and into something that resembled actual participation. Whether that moment was real or a product of good performance is something the episode leaves deliberately unresolved, which is one of the reasons it has stayed in audiences' memories for more than 25 years. The crime that followed was carried out at the movie theater. Mr. Krabs, suspicious of the friendship from the beginning and convinced Plankton had not changed despite what SpongeBob insisted, brought a Krabby Patty to the theater and attempted to tempt Plankton with it during the film, expecting him to betray himself. Plankton did not take the bait. That moment was interpreted by SpongeBob as proof of genuine change. What had actually happened was that Plankton had already secured a Krabby Patty through other means and was carrying it in his pocket, concealed beneath the surface of what looked like an evening out with a friend. Krabs then demanded, from the front of the theater, that everyone in the audience reach into the pocket of the person next to them. The crowd complied with this request in a way that only makes sense in Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob's hand went into Plankton's pocket and came out with the patty. The discovery dismantled everything. SpongeBob stood there, holding the evidence of a friendship that had been a performance from the start, and the hurt on his face was the kind that the show usually reserved for much bigger stakes. Plankton, cornered, made one final play at the emotional register he had been practicing all episode. He said that through this whole experience, he had come to realize that friendship was all he ever truly wanted. Then he grabbed the patty and sprinted for the movie screen, shouting that being evil was too much fun, and tore straight through the screen into the solid concrete wall behind it. The wall stopped him. The patty was recovered. Plankton left the theater squashed and defeated. But the crime on the ledger from that episode was not simple theft. It was something that required sustained deception across multiple interactions with a person who genuinely believed in him. Plankton had to learn a song. He had to carry the performance through Jellyfish Fields and a movie theater, and a moment of apparent hesitation when offered an easy exit. However it ended, the execution of that scheme demanded more from him than any robot had. The second major manipulation crime of the early seasons happened on a beach, and it is the one episode in Plankton's entire catalog where the formula was not the target. Goo Lagoon was a popular stretch of oceanside beach in Bikini Bottom, and Plankton wanted it. His plan was to develop it into a second Chum Bucket location, a scaled-up version of his restaurant he was calling the Mega Bucket, which he believed would draw business from the crowds that already visited the area. The problem was that the beach was full of people enjoying themselves, and no one was going to leave because Plankton, who stood below the threshold of most residents' hearing range, told them to. His tiny bulldozer and his megaphone produced nothing except a child picking up his vehicle and carrying it away like a toy. He needed someone larger to clear the space. SpongeBob was at Goo Lagoon that same afternoon, being walked over by everyone around him, unable to assert himself in even the most basic social situations. Someone sat on him. Someone stole his ice cream. Someone borrowed his metal detector and simply did not give it back. Plankton saw all of this and understood what he was looking at. SpongeBob did not need to be controlled by a brain device. He needed to be coached. Specifically, he needed to be told that assertive behavior was a form of kindness, and that standing up for himself was actually a way of helping others. The coaching began with the ice cream. Plankton entered SpongeBob's mouth and delivered a threat to the eel who had taken the cone, speaking in SpongeBob's voice, making demands on SpongeBob's behalf. The eel backed down. SpongeBob experienced something that felt, from the inside, like confidence. Plankton told him this was what assertiveness looked like. SpongeBob believed it. He spent the next stretch of the episode working through a curriculum designed to look like personal development and functioning, in practice as a series of escalating antisocial acts directed at the people who were simply trying to enjoy the beach. He cut kite strings. He swallowed hot dogs from the stand, taking them directly from people who had already purchased them. He popped a volleyball in the middle of a game. By the time the beach was empty, SpongeBob had committed multiple acts of property destruction and food theft across a public space, all of them performed under the belief that he was growing as a person. Plankton revealed the real plan at that point, which was when SpongeBob understood what had happened. He had been weaponized. Plankton had not taught him assertiveness, he had taught him to clear a construction site. SpongeBob's response was to become, in his own framing, aggressively nice. He reversed every harm he had caused, returned what he had taken, repaired what he had broken, and transformed himself into a human surfboard and then a volleyball to provide free entertainment to the returning crowd. The Mega Bucket was never built. Plankton left the beach having lost both the location and the person he had used to try to acquire it. The crime profile from the Goo Lagoon scheme is different from everything that came before it. No formula was targeted. No Krabby Patty was involved. What Plankton attempted was the fraudulent acquisition of a public beach through the unauthorized use of a third party as a demolition instrument. He misrepresented his intentions. He deceived his instrument about the nature of what was being asked of him. He directed a series of thefts and acts of property destruction against members of the public without their knowledge or consent. He attempted to seize land he had no claim to. And he did all of it without a single piece of technology, working entirely through words and the particular vulnerability of someone who wanted very badly to be told he was doing things right. Both of these crimes, the fake friendship at the movies and the beach clearance scheme, established something about Plankton's criminal range that the brain device alone had not. He was not purely a technology villain. He was also a social predator, capable of identifying exactly what someone needed to believe about themselves and providing a version of it that served his purposes. With SpongeBob, the target was always the same: his trust. SpongeBob trusted so completely and so quickly that exploiting it required almost no warm-up. Plankton had to want to be his friend, and SpongeBob took it from there. What the early seasons were building, across these manipulation schemes, was a portrait of a criminal who understood his environment at a level most cartoon villains do not bother with. Plankton studied the people around him the way a scientist studies a problem. He noted SpongeBob's doormat tendencies at the beach and converted them into a tool. He noted SpongeBob's loneliness and his belief in Plankton's loneliness and built a friendship around the overlap. Both observations were accurate. Both were converted into schemes. The accuracy of the observation did not make the scheme any less cold. If anything, it made it colder, because it meant that Plankton was paying close enough attention to actually understand people. He simply chose to use that understanding exclusively as a mechanism for getting what he wanted. The detail that both schemes failed because of SpongeBob's fundamental nature, rather than any external force, is worth holding on to. The friendship con collapsed because Plankton reached into his pocket for the patty at the wrong moment. The beach scheme collapsed because SpongeBob's instinct, once he understood the deception, was to undo every harm he had caused. In both cases, the thing that defeated Plankton was not a trap or a plan or a piece of counter-technology. It was just SpongeBob being SpongeBob in a direction Plankton had not accounted for. The brain device had been defeated by a song. The friendship con was defeated by a crowd pocket search in a movie theater. The beach scheme was defeated by aggressive kindness. The pattern was already forming by the end of the first season. Plankton's plans were sophisticated enough to reach the final stage almost every time, and they fell apart at that final stage not through brilliant opposition, but through the world being slightly more chaotic than any plan could fully model. The chum bucket sat empty through all of it. Karen watched the schemes unfold and fail from her screen. The road between the two restaurants stayed the same width. Plankton filed away what had not worked, thought about what might, and started again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fake friendship and beach fraud were the quiet crimes. Coming up, Plankton abandons patience entirely and builds a robot duplicate of Mr. Krabs to walk through the front door of the Krusty Krab and ask SpongeBob for the formula directly. Section 3. The Robot Years. Plankton's obsession with stealing the Krabby Patty formula led him to create some of his most elaborate schemes, including building robots designed to infiltrate the Krusty Krab. These machines required careful planning, engineering, and construction long before any crime could even begin. One of his earliest and most famous creations was a robot disguised as Mr. Krabs, matching his size, movements, and appearance. Hidden inside the chest was Plankton himself, controlling the machine as he attempted to get close to SpongeBob and finally obtain the secret formula. On paper, the logic holds. SpongeBob trusts Mr. Krabs completely. SpongeBob follows Mr. Krabs' instructions without requiring explanations. If the robot was convincing enough, Plankton would not need to steal anything. He would simply ask, and SpongeBob would hand it over. The crime becomes a transaction. The transaction becomes a formula. The formula becomes the chum bucket's salvation. The chain of reasoning is clean from one end to the other, and the only variable it required to hold was the quality of the robot. The robot was not quite good enough. Before the Mr. Krabs version, there had been an earlier attempt in the same episode that began with a different disguise. Plankton arrived at the Krusty Krab posing as a robotic salesman, not impersonating anyone specific, just presenting himself as a commercial representative who wanted to discuss business. His opening offer to SpongeBob was $1 million in exchange for the secret formula. SpongeBob refused without any apparent temptation. Plankton shed the salesman disguise and threatened SpongeBob directly, which was also unsuccessful, and Mr. Krabs arrived in time to physically remove him from the building and send him back across the road via the suction tube method that Krabs had apparently developed specifically for this recurring situation. The failure of the frontal approach sent Plankton back to the lab, where the Mr. Krabs robot was already in development, or was built in response to that failed direct attempt. Either way, the construction of a full-sized replica of his rival represented a significant escalation in both effort and technical ambition. Whatever Plankton's other failures were, engineering was not among them. The robot moved, it spoke, it wore the right color. It had enough detail to get past Squidward, who encountered it first and dismissed it, which is a lower bar than getting past SpongeBob, but still a meaningful test of the disguise's surface credibility. SpongeBob was harder. The episode developed into a sustained, comic negotiation between the robot Krabs and SpongeBob, who had been told by the real Mr. Krabs to discuss the formula only with him. SpongeBob took this instruction literally and absolutely. Every time the robot Krabs attempted to introduce the topic of the formula, SpongeBob found a way to avoid it while remaining technically cooperative. The robot ordered him to do increasingly elaborate tasks as Plankton tried to find an angle, and SpongeBob completed each one with complete sincerity while never quite arriving at the formula conversation. The scheme unraveled through a penny. Mr. Krabs, the real one, returned and was horrified to see what appeared to be himself handing over the formula to SpongeBob on a piece of paper. He was actually watching SpongeBob hand a piece of paper to the robot, having been tricked into thinking the robot had finally gotten what it came for. In the chaos of Krabs' arrival, SpongeBob made the connection between a penny slot visible on the robot's body and the standard operating principle that his actual employer ran on. He inserted a penny. The robot announced a self-destruct sequence. It exploded. Plankton was launched back across the road. The criminal charges from that episode include construction and deployment of a fraudulent impersonation device, criminal impersonation of a specific named individual for the purpose of obtaining property, attempted theft by deception, and trespass. The impersonation specifically is worth noting because Plankton did not just wear a costume. He built a walking, talking replica of a real person and operated it in that person's workplace, in front of that person's employees, claiming to be that person in order to extract something of significant value. The scale of the forgery involved was considerable. The card game crime came later, in the second season, and it operated through a completely different mechanism. Mr. Krabs and Plankton had, apparently, a standing weekly card game. The episode revealed this as an established fact, without explaining when it had started or why two sworn enemies would maintain a social ritual together, which is the kind of detail SpongeBob SquarePants tends to introduce fully formed and let the audience accept without interrogation. They played cards once a week. At some point during one of those games, Plankton cheated. The specific nature of the cheating is not shown in detail, but its outcome was unambiguous. Plankton won SpongeBob's employment contract in the game. Under the terms that Mr. Krabs then felt bound to honor, SpongeBob was now Plankton's employee and was required to report to the chum bucket. Krabs had apparently been willing to stake the contract of his most valuable and irreplaceable employee in a card game against his most persistent and openly stated enemy, which is a separate issue and one the episode does not dwell on. The relevant fact is that Plankton had cheated, won something he had no legitimate claim to, and now had legal possession of SpongeBob SquarePants. He used this possession immediately and without any warmth. SpongeBob arrived at the chum bucket and was told to make a Krabby Patty. SpongeBob, miserable and homesick in the cold laboratory environment of the chum bucket kitchen, was unable to cook anything at all. His food depended on a specific emotional condition, on joy and warmth and the familiar sounds of the Krusty Krab, and none of those things were present. Every patty he produced in the chum bucket came out wrong. Plankton's frustration escalated until he threatened to remove SpongeBob's brain and install it in a robot version of SpongeBob, the idea being that a mechanical SpongeBob with the original brain would be more compliant and easier to direct. He followed through on the threat. SpongeBob's brain was extracted and placed inside a robot duplicate. Plankton ordered the robot to make a Krabby Patty. The robot refused. SpongeBob's brain, transplanted into a metal body and stripped of the Krusty Krab, of Gary, of Patrick, of every attachment that gave the cooking its character, still declined. Karen had predicted this. She had told Plankton, before the brain transplant, that the robot approach never worked. This was apparently not the first time he had tried it. The implication of Karen's comment is that a version of this crime had been committed before, off-screen, with the same result. Plankton gave up and returned SpongeBob's brain to its original location. He then attempted to return SpongeBob himself to Mr. Krabs, not out of generosity, but because having SpongeBob in the building had proven to be more trouble than the contract was worth. He paid Krabs $50 to take SpongeBob back. The man who had cheated to acquire a valuable employee paid $50 to be rid of that employee after less than a day. The crime ledger from that episode includes fraud in a card game, unlawful transfer of an employment contract obtained through deception, forced labor under fraudulent authority, and surgical removal and relocation of a living brain without consent. The brain removal is worth pausing on because it is easy to let the comedy of it slide past without registering what was actually done. Plankton physically extracted the brain from a living creature, placed it in a machine, and expected the creature's consciousness to then perform tasks on command. This is distinct from the mind control device used in the first episode. That device left the brain in place and redirected its signals. The chum bucket crime involved removing the brain from the body entirely and relocating it. These are different categories of neurological crime, and Plankton committed both of them before the second season was finished. The life-switching crime came in the third season and was the most conceptually ambitious thing Plankton had attempted up to that point. Rather than trying to take the formula from Mr. Krabs, Plankton decided to take Mr. Krabs' entire existence. He had built a machine capable of transporting him into an alternate version of reality, one in which he was the successful restaurateur and Mr. Krabs was the struggling nobody across the street. He called it the "switch lives just to know what it's like" omogrifier. He used it. The alternate bikini bottom he arrived in was structurally identical to the real one, with one significant difference. The nameplate on the office desk at the Krusty Krab read Mr. Plankton instead of Mr. Krabs. He was the owner. SpongeBob was his fry cook. The formula was somewhere in the building. He had, through a single machine and without any direct confrontation, obtained everything the years of theft attempts had failed to produce. The reality of running the Krusty Krab unraveled quickly. SpongeBob needed constant management and emotional reassurance at a rate that made actual work impossible. Squidward demanded impossible accommodations and threatened to quit every few minutes. Pearl arrived wanting money. In alternate Mr. Krabs, now living Plankton's old life on the other side of the road, started showing up and trying to steal the formula, which gave Plankton the experience of being on the receiving end of the crime he had spent his entire career committing. The irony was delivered without commentary. It did not need any. Plankton switched back before he ever read the formula. The version of Mr. Krabs' life that he had imagined, successful and calm and defined by the possession of something valuable, was nothing like the version he actually landed in. Running a restaurant was relentless. The formula, even in a reality where he theoretically owned it, was no easier to access than it had been across the road. He returned to the chum bucket and his holographic meatloaf, and the real Mr. Krabs walked back through his own front door. The crime from that episode was unauthorized dimensional trespass and identity appropriation at the level of an entire life. Plankton entered a reality that was not his, occupied a position he had not earned, made staffing decisions over employees who had no knowledge of who he actually was, and attempted to access intellectual property that even in that alternate configuration did not belong to him. He used a machine to bypass every legitimate path to success and install himself directly into the outcome he wanted. It failed not because anyone stopped him, but because the outcome he wanted was not what he had imagined it to be. Taken together, the robot years show a Plankton who was expanding his criminal toolkit at a significant rate. The brain device of the first episode gave way to a full-sized impersonation robot. The impersonation robot gave way to card game fraud and brain surgery. Brain surgery gave way to dimensional appropriation. Each escalation was a response to the failure of the previous approach, and each new approach required more resources, more engineering, and more willingness to cross lines that a previous version of the plan had left intact. The robot Krabs was a forgery. The card game was fraud. The brain transplant was medical crime. The dimension switch was something that does not have a clean legal category, because no legal system has written statutes for it, but the intent was clear. Take what belongs to someone else by removing yourself from the reality in which you do not have it. What all four of these crimes share is a specific characteristic that separates them from simple theft. Each one required Plankton to substitute himself for something legitimate. The robot substituted for the real Mr. Krabs. The fraudulent card win substituted for a legitimate employment arrangement. The brain transplant substituted for a willing and cooperative cook. The dimension switch substituted for a life actually built. Plankton was not just stealing, he was replacing real things with versions he had manufactured. The replacements were always slightly wrong. The robot had a penny slot. The transplanted brain would not cooperate. The alternate restaurant was exhausting. The formula, even when apparently within reach, kept not arriving. Every substitution he built had a flaw he had not designed for, and that flaw was always the one that ended the crime. The Chumbucket's laboratory grew more elaborate with each scheme. Karen cataloged the failures. The equipment list expanded, and across the road, the Krusty Krab kept selling Krabby Patties to a line of customers that never seemed to shorten, while Plankton watched from his window and thought about what he had not tried yet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Robots and dimension hopping were the third season's answer to everything that came before. Coming up, Plankton takes the whole operation to court, fakes a physical injury, sues Mr. Krabs, and nearly walks out of a trial with the formula handed to him by a judge. Section 4. The Lawsuit. The Krabs vs. Plankton episode from Season 4 gave Plankton his most patient crime to date. He walked into the Krusty Krab, slipped on a recently mopped floor, and sued Mr. Krabs for personal injury. No robot, no brain device, no disguise. Just a neck brace, a courtroom, and the ability to lie convincingly on a witness stand while a judge and jury processed his fraudulent claim. The lawsuit was built to force Mr. Krabs into a position where handing over the Krabby Patty secret formula was cheaper than losing the case, and for most of the episode's runtime, it was working. The setup was simple. The Krusty Krab had recently mopped its floors. Plankton entered, slipped on the wet surface, and went down hard. Mr. Krabs, who observed this, was not particularly moved by the sight of his arch-rival face down on his clean floor. What he did not immediately understand was that the fall was not an accident. Plankton had entered the Krusty Krab that day with a plan that did not involve the formula at all, or at least not in the way his plans usually involved it. He was not there to steal anything. He was there to fall down, and then make that fall into the most expensive thing Mr. Krabs had ever allowed to happen on his property. Plankton sued. The case was styled as a personal injury claim arising from the negligent maintenance of a wet floor without adequate warning. In Bikini Bottom's legal system, this was apparently sufficient grounds for a full trial, complete with a judge, a jury, a witness stand, and a prosecution and defense presenting arguments over multiple days. Mr. Krabs could not afford a lawyer. The legal fees alone were threatening to consume whatever the judgment might save. SpongeBob, watching his employer deteriorate under the pressure of the proceedings, offered to serve as Krabs' legal representative, changed his name temporarily to SpongeBob Lawyer Pants, and took the case. The trial itself was a layered crime. Plankton had faked his injury, which was fraud committed against the court from the moment he filed the claim. He then testified about that injury, describing the circumstances of his fall and the damage it had caused him, which added perjury to the ledger. He negotiated from the witness stand, offering to drop the suit entirely if Mr. Krabs would simply hand over the Krabby Patty secret formula as a settlement, which added attempted extortion to a list that was growing with each session of testimony. The lawsuit was not about the fall. It had never been about the fall. The entire legal proceeding was a mechanism for forcing Mr. Krabs into a position where handing over the formula was the cheaper option. It almost worked. The jury was sympathetic. The judge appeared open to the settlement framing. Mr. Krabs, who had no legal representation he trusted, was visibly losing ground. The economics of the situation were turning against him in a way that brute force and physical ejection had never managed to accomplish. Plankton, seated in the witness chair in a neck brace he had no medical reason to be wearing, was watching his enemy calculate the cost of resistance and find it too high. SpongeBob saved the situation through a piece of misdirection that the episode treats as legal genius and is probably better described as accidental brilliance. He produced a Krabby Patty and placed it in front of Plankton on the witness stand, within reach, while asking him questions about the formula. Plankton, presented with a Krabby Patty at close range, could not maintain his performance. His entire history, his obsession, his complete inability to be near the thing he wanted most without reaching for it, collapsed the legal fiction he had built around himself. He grabbed the patty. He ran for the exit. He announced his true intentions out loud in the middle of the courtroom while holding the evidence of his fraud in his hands and sprinting toward the door. Mr. Krabs caught him. The patty was recovered. The jury deliberated and found Mr. Krabs not liable, while noting for the record that he was, admittedly, quite cheap. Plankton was arrested off-screen for crimes that the episode does not itemize, but that the trial record would have made fairly straightforward to prosecute. Fraud, perjury, attempted extortion, filing a false legal claim. These are serious charges in any jurisdiction, and Bikini Bottom apparently processed them efficiently enough that Plankton was back at the chum bucket in subsequent episodes without any visible period of incarceration. The genius of the lawsuit crime, from a criminal analysis standpoint, is how completely it avoided Plankton's usual weaknesses. Every previous scheme had failed at a physical threshold. The robot was too obviously mechanical up close. The brain device worked until Plankton left SpongeBob's skull and reached for the patty himself. The card game worked until SpongeBob proved impossible to direct, even with his brain in a different body. Each failure had a physical component, a moment where something tangible went wrong in the real world. The lawsuit had no physical component to fail. It was pure procedure. It ran on paperwork and testimony, and the formal rules of a legal proceeding. Plankton could sit in a chair, wear a neck brace, and let the system generate pressure on his behalf. He did not have to be in a position where his size, his speed, or his tendency to grab the nearest Krabby Patty could betray him. SpongeBob betrayed him instead, by doing the one thing a competent opposing lawyer would have known not to do: place the object of Plankton's obsession directly in front of him during cross-examination. The trick worked precisely because SpongeBob did not think like a lawyer. He thought like someone who knew Plankton, and knowing Plankton meant knowing that the formula was not an abstract goal to be pursued through institutional channels. It was something Plankton could not see without wanting, and could not want without reaching, and could not reach without giving himself away. The courtroom that Plankton had converted into his most sophisticated crime scene became the place where his most fundamental flaw destroyed the plan. The broader criminal architecture of that season did not stop at the courtroom. Another crime from the same stretch of episodes involved Plankton attempting to date Mr. Krabs' mother as a strategy for extracting the formula from the family. The episode introduced Mama Krabs, and within it, Plankton identified her as an access point to information that direct theft had consistently failed to produce. His approach was romantic. He presented himself as an eligible companion, arranged a courtship, and spent time with her in a way that was designed to eventually produce a conversation about the formula, which he presumably expected her to know or to be able to find out. The crime profile here involves deception at the level of personal intimacy, which is a category Plankton had not previously entered. Faking friendship with SpongeBob required performing warmth towards someone who was already primed to extend it. Faking romantic interest in Mama Krabs required performing something more specific and more sustained. He had to appear attracted to her, interested in her life, and genuinely invested in the relationship for long enough to reach the moment where she might discuss something useful. Whatever his actual feelings about the courtship were, the purpose was purely instrumental. She was an information source. He was accessing her through the least direct and most emotionally costly route he had yet attempted. Mama Krabs eventually discovered what he was after. The discovery ended with her returning him to the chum bucket at considerable velocity. The formula did not change hands. But the crime was real, regardless of its failure. Sustained romantic deception for the purpose of obtaining property information, perpetrated against an elderly woman who had no awareness of what she was participating in. Around the same period, Plankton demonstrated that his criminal ambitions were not always formula-focused, by attempting to seize a public institution for private commercial use. The target was Goo Lagoon, which he had tried to acquire in the first season by clearing the beach through SpongeBob. That attempt had failed. His approach to the problem the second time was different, and involved a much larger piece of equipment. He arrived at the lagoon in a submarine, used the vessel to locate and open a crack in the sea floor, and caused a massive bubble of purple goo to rise to the surface. The goo bubble was enormous, entertaining, and quickly became the most popular attraction at the beach. Plankton had manufactured a spectacle, and then positioned himself to control it. His plan was to use the bubble as leverage. Once everyone in Bikini Bottom was dependent on the goo for entertainment, he would offer access in exchange for the formula. The Krusty Krab's customers would choose the bubble over their loyalty to Krabs. Krabs would capitulate. The formula would arrive. The scheme was more sophisticated than the first Goo Lagoon attempt because it did not require clearing people away from a space. It required attracting them to something he controlled and then turning their attachment into a bargaining chip. The bubble was eventually destroyed through an explosive, which Mr. Krabs deployed after determining that the threat to his business justified the collateral damage to a recreational landmark. Plankton escaped in his submarine, but not before revealing, through the reading of a fake formula he had extracted from the situation, that the entire operation had been a commercial trap. The crimes from that episode include unauthorized drilling into a public seabed, deliberate geological modification of a shared natural space for commercial purposes, and attempted extortion of a specific piece of intellectual property through the manufacture of artificial dependency. None of this was out of character. By the middle of the series' run, Plankton had demonstrated an ability to think about crime at multiple scales simultaneously. He could plan a scheme that targeted one person, like the lawsuit against Krabs, and he could plan a scheme that targeted an entire community, like the goo bubble at the lagoon. He could work through intimate social deception, like the courtship of Mama Krabs, and he could work through large infrastructure, like a submarine drilling operation. The formula was almost always the end goal, but the paths he found toward it kept expanding in both direction and ambition. What the lawsuit episode in particular added to the record was a demonstration that Plankton understood institutions. He understood that courts existed, that they processed claims according to formal rules, and that those rules could be exploited by someone willing to construct a false claim carefully enough to survive initial scrutiny. He had not used a robot or a machine. He had used the legal system itself as his instrument. That is a different category of criminal intelligence than anything his earlier schemes had required, and it suggested that the escalation in his methods was not simply about acquiring more powerful technology. It was about acquiring more powerful systems. The other thing the lawsuit revealed was the depth of preparation Plankton was capable of when a scheme required patience. Building a robot is fast work compared to sustaining a legal case. A robot either works or it does not, usually within minutes of deployment. A lawsuit unfolds over days, requires consistent performance across multiple appearances, and demands that the perpetrator maintain a false physical condition, the fake injury, without wavering in front of a judge and jury and opposing counsel and a public gallery. Plankton wore that neck brace through the entire trial. He testified about pain that did not exist. He maintained the fiction through cross-examination by a lawyer who, despite having no legal training, was doing his genuine best to expose him. The neck brace only came off when the Patty arrived on the witness stand. The fact that a Krabby Patty defeated him in a courtroom is, in retrospect, the most Plankton possible ending to the most sophisticated crime he had committed up to that point. He had outmaneuvered the system. He had constructed a scheme that operated on rules rather than on physical force, which should have protected it from the physical failures that had ended every previous plan. He had calculated correctly that Mr. Krabs would struggle to mount a defense without legal resources. He had not calculated that SpongeBob would put a Krabby Patty on the witness stand. That miscalculation cost him the case, his freedom for at least a brief period, and whatever credibility the neck brace had accumulated over the course of the proceedings. The criminal file from this period of Plankton's career is the most varied of any equivalent stretch across the series. Fraud, perjury, extortion, romantic deception, geological sabotage, commercial extortion through manufactured public dependency, court fraud. These are not crimes of opportunity. They are crimes of design, each one requiring significant planning and resources before the first step of execution. The Plankton who tried to smuggle himself out of the Krusty Krab under a burger in the first season was still present in these schemes, still fundamentally driven by the same want, but the sophistication of the approach had developed in directions that the debut episode had not entirely predicted. What remained constant was the failure. Every scheme in this stretch of the series ended the same way the first one had. Plankton returning to the chum bucket without the formula, the road between the two restaurants exactly as wide as it had always been, Karen processing the results of another failed attempt while Plankton recalibrated. The recalibration was always fast. Whatever defeat he had just experienced, he was already thinking about what came next before the episode ended. That relentlessness was not just a character trait, it was the engine of the entire criminal record. Plankton did not stop between schemes. he accumulated them. By the time the fourth season closed, the ledger was long and varied, and still without a single permanent entry in the success column. The formula was exactly where it had always been. Plankton was exactly where he had always been. The distance between those two facts was the whole story, and he had not stopped finding new ways to try to close it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fraud and extortion were the fourth season's answer to everything the robots could not accomplish. Coming up, Plankton recruits the largest army he has ever assembled, calls in every relative he has across the ocean floor, and comes closer to the formula than almost any other plan before or since, stopped by a recipe that turned out to be something no one was meant to read. Section 5. The Army Plankton's Army aired on January 19, 2004, and marked the 25th anniversary within the show's own internal timeline of Plankton's first attempt to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Mr. Krabs knew it was coming and treated it as a tactical event on his calendar. The Krusty Krab went into a state of heightened readiness. Every employee was briefed. Every entry point was monitored. The kitchen was locked down. Krabs had been tracking the anniversary date and preparing for it in a way that tells you something about how seriously he took the rhythm of Plankton's scheming, even when the individual attempts were easy to defeat. Plankton's first move that day was conventional. He sent a robot into the Krusty Krab as a customer. The robot was designed to blend in, to order food like a normal patron, to create no suspicion. It purchased a single serving of chili coral bits using a dollar bill. The dollar bill had a hidden compartment. When the robot paid and the transaction was complete, Plankton burst out of the compartment in the dollar, announced himself, and demanded Mr. Krabs hand over the formula at gunpoint, which in this context meant whatever small weapon a microscopic planktonic organism could reasonably threaten someone with. Mr. Krabs was waiting for exactly this. The response was immediate and physical, and ended with Plankton flushed down a toilet. He returned to the chum bucket, and Karen told him what she had been telling him for years. He needed help. Not a better machine, not a more convincing disguise, not a more elaborate robot. Actual help. People. An army. Plankton's response to this suggestion was to try a nightclub first, walking in and attempting to recruit hardened criminals into his operation by offering them the promise of unlimited Krabby Patties and world domination. The criminals in the nightclub were not interested. They looked at him, processed the gap between what he was asking and what he was, and declined. What Plankton had was not criminals. What Plankton had was family. He had thousands of relatives distributed across the ocean, had apparently not been in contact with most of them for a significant period, and had maintained in his imagination a picture of what those relatives were like. The picture was flattering to him. He imagined a network of evil geniuses, each one as intelligent and as driven as he was, each one capable of sophisticated criminal planning and technical execution. He imagined an army of Planktons, miniature masterminds who had simply been waiting for the call. He sent the invitations. They came. They were rednecks, every single one of them. They arrived playing country music and wearing boots and carrying the particular energy of people who had driven a long way and were ready for root beer. Clem introduced the group, working through a list of names that included Zeke, Rufus, Jeek, Billy Bob, Billy Jim, Billy Billy Bo Willie Banana Fana Fo Philly, Doug, Enos, Julio, Fletcher McGee, Rainchild, and Zeke Jr., among others. Plankton stood in front of this crowd and understood that he had been away from home longer than he thought. The evil genius network he had imagined existed only in his imagination. His actual family were cheerful, dim-witted, and completely comfortable with doing whatever he asked as long as root beer was involved. He adapted. The plan required bodies more than it required intelligence, and bodies were what he had. He called them to order inside the chum bucket, explained the objective, and offered the agreed compensation: unlimited root beer upon completion of the mission. There was one logistical problem. Plankton's full name, Sheldon, was displayed on Karen's screen during the briefing, which she found so entertaining that she kept flashing it at every opportunity, and the family found it equally amusing. Plankton got through the laughter, suppressed his dignity, and continued with the briefing. During the meeting, his first name became the most significant vulnerability of the operation. Karen's screen kept showing it. The family kept laughing. Plankton had to maintain authority over a room full of relatives who now knew his name was Sheldon. He managed it, but the detail matters because it was a flaw in the planning that had nothing to do with the Krusty Krab's defenses. The security weakness was inside his own home, in his own wife's display habits, and it nearly derailed the briefing before the Army had taken a single step toward the target. The assault on the Krusty Krab was genuinely effective in a way that most of Plankton's schemes were not. The sheer number of bodies overwhelmed the normal defensive response. Mr. Krabs could flick one Plankton across the road. He could not flick several thousand. The family poured in, occupied the building, and restrained both Mr. Krabs and Squidward, who were tied up in a toilet, in a sequence that the show presented as comedic humiliation for the two of them. SpongeBob was sent on an errand before the assault began, a minor task that removed him from the building at the critical moment, which meant the restaurant was defended only by the people Plankton had spent the least time worrying about. With Krabs and Squidward secured and SpongeBob off the premises, the Plankton family located the safe. They opened it. Inside was a book. The book contained the Krabby Patty secret formula, or what appeared to be the Krabby Patty secret formula, sitting in print, readable by anyone with access to the page. Plankton stood in front of it. 25 years of attempts, of robots and brain devices and fake birthdays and neck braces and card game fraud and dimensional switches and nightclub recruitment and country music relatives. All of it had led to this moment. The book was open. The formula was there. Mr. Krabs, restrained but still present, pleaded with Plankton not to read it. His exact words were that there are some things in this world that were not meant to be seen by mortal eyes. This should have been a warning. Plankton read it anyway. The formula, as printed in the book Plankton had spent 25 years trying to reach, listed its ingredients as a pinch of salt, a pinch of turmeric, and a pinch of... and then concluded with a component that the episode rendered as a visual gag so specifically horrible that every member of the Plankton family who could read ran screaming from the building. Clem, who could not read, was asked to leave by Mr. Krabs personally. The formula was a fake. Mr. Krabs had planted it specifically for the 25th anniversary, anticipating that Plankton would eventually try something significant to mark the occasion. The real formula was somewhere else, somewhere Plankton had not found, and Mr. Krabs was not going to describe. His gloating was complete and unhurried. He had known Plankton was coming. He had built a trap for him and baited it with a recipe. The recipe's final ingredient was enough to scatter an army. The criminal charges from that operation are substantial. Plankton had constructed a cover purchasing scheme using a robot and a concealed compartment, which was fraud and criminal trespass. He had organized and led an assault on a private business, which involved restraining its employees by force, which was assault, unlawful restraint, and criminal trespass at a minimum. He had broken into a safe, which was burglary regardless of what the safe turned out to contain. He had recruited co-conspirators in the form of his family, who were present and participating, which extended the conspiracy charges to everyone who had come through the door. The fact that the formula was fake did not retroactively remove the crimes committed in the process of reaching it. The safe was still broken into. The employees were still tied up. The restaurant was still occupied by force. The 25th anniversary operation also revealed something about Plankton's relationship to his own history that the previous schemes had only implied. He had been counting. He knew exactly how long he had been trying. The anniversary mattered to him. He had planned something significant for it, which means he had been looking ahead to it, treating it as a milestone, as a date with some meaning beyond a simple number. 25 years of failure was not, in Plankton's internal accounting, discouraging. It was a record. And a record that long deserved a proportional response. The response he built, the family army and the assault and the safe and the book, was the most labor-intensive scheme he had yet executed. It required him to admit that he needed help, to reach out to relatives he had not spoken to in years, to manage a group of people who were not under his control in any meaningful sense, and who were only participating because of root beer. He had to compromise on his image of himself as a lone genius. He had to accept assistance from people whose intelligence he considered significantly beneath his own. He had to listen to his name being displayed on a screen and laughed at by his cousins in the middle of an operational briefing, and continue the briefing anyway. Every part of the planning required a kind of flexibility that his earlier schemes had not, because earlier schemes relied on machines, and machines did not laugh at him. The fact that the formula was a fake is the detail that makes the anniversary operation uniquely painful in Plankton's catalog. Every previous failure had involved something going wrong during the execution. A robot exploded, a brain device was defeated by a song, a lawsuit collapsed when a patty appeared on the witness stand. Those failures happened in the field, in the moment, through some combination of external interference and Plankton's own inability to be near a Krabby Patty without losing composure. The anniversary failure was different. Nothing went wrong during the execution. The army performed exactly as directed. The safe was opened, the book was read. The failure was architectural. Mr. Krabs had built the failure into the target itself, decades in advance, and Plankton had walked his entire family directly into it. The aftermath left Plankton without his army, who dispersed back across the ocean floor, presumably having received their root beer at some point during the proceedings, and without any meaningful progress on the formula. He was back where he always ended up, alone in the chum bucket, across the road from the Krusty Krab, the formula no closer than it had been before the invitations went out. Karen processed the results. Plankton recalibrated. The 25th anniversary had come and gone, and the ledger was unchanged. What the Army scheme established, beyond its place in the criminal record, was that Plankton had fully explored the landscape of what solo crime could accomplish. He had tried direct theft, social manipulation, robot impersonation, brain surgery, card fraud, dimensional appropriation, geological sabotage, and legal fraud. He had now tried organized criminal recruitment and coordinated assault. The one thing none of those approaches had managed was sustained, uninterrupted access to the actual formula in a form he could read and retain. The fake book had come closest in one sense, because he had physically opened the safe and stood over the document. But even that proximity had been manufactured by his enemy as a trap. The next phase of Plankton's criminal career began to explore crimes that worked differently than everything before them. Rather than attacking the formula directly, he started attacking the conditions around it. Rather than trying to take the thing, he started trying to change the environment so that the thing would come to him. Fear of a Krabby Patty was a scheme built on this logic. Plankton opened the chum bucket for 23 hours a day, which forced Mr. Krabs to match the hours by keeping the Krusty Krab open for a full 24. The extended hours exhausted SpongeBob. The exhaustion produced hallucinations. The hallucinations produced, eventually, a genuine psychological condition in which SpongeBob was afraid of Krabby Patties. Plankton then installed himself as a therapist under the alias Peter Plankton, positioned himself as the person who could cure SpongeBob's condition, and used the hypnotherapy sessions to try to extract the formula from SpongeBob's mind while he was under. The hypnosis worked in the sense that it accessed SpongeBob's unconscious knowledge of the formula. It failed in the sense that SpongeBob, during the hypnotic state, dreamed a resolution to his fear rather than verbalizing the formula. He woke up cured. Plankton lost his patient and his access simultaneously. The scheme had required him to deliberately destroy a person's mental health, then construct a false professional identity to exploit that destruction, then use a clinical technique to try to reach information stored in the victim's memory. The harm done to SpongeBob through weeks of sleep deprivation and induced psychosis was real and measurable within the episode's own terms. The therapeutic deception compounded it. That Plankton left without the formula does not reduce what the scheme required him to do to get to the point of failure. The criminal accumulation by the end of this stretch of the series represented something qualitatively different from the early episodes. The first season's crimes were audacious but contained. Breaking into a skull, faking a birthday, clearing a beach. The crimes of the middle seasons operated at larger scales, involved more victims, caused more widespread harm, and required more sustained planning to execute. The lawsuit had run through an entire legal proceeding. The family army had involved coordinated assault by hundreds of co-conspirators. The manufactured sleep deprivation scheme had destroyed the mental health of the show's main character over a period of weeks. Each crime was bigger than the ones before it, not always in physical terms, but in the number of people affected and the duration of the harm. Plankton never acknowledged any of this. He did not carry guilt from one episode to the next. Whatever SpongeBob had suffered under Peter Plankton's hypnotherapy was not something Plankton thought about when he returned to the chum bucket. Whatever Mr. Krabs' employees had endured when tied up in a toilet while a family of redneck Plankton raided the safe was not something Plankton filed away as a cost. The crimes were complete when they failed. The failures were processed and set aside. New plans were already forming. The accumulation existed only in the record, not in any internal accounting Plankton was keeping about what his ambition had cost the people around him. 25 years in, the formula was still across the road. The road was still the same width. The chum bucket's kitchen was still producing food that nobody wanted. And Plankton, who had tried every approach available to a single criminal mastermind, and had now tried recruiting an army, and had tried manufacturing a psychological condition, and had tried every legal and illegal and extra-dimensional avenue the series had provided him, was already thinking about what he had not yet attempted. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 25 years and a family army were not enough. Coming up, the biggest crime in Plankton's entire career, the one that actually worked, the one that took down a god, framed an innocent man, and turned all of Bikini Bottom into a slave colony wearing bucket helmets. Section 6, Plan Z. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie, released in 2004 and directed by series creator Steven Hillenburg, was intended as the show's finale. It is also the only entry in Plankton's full criminal record in which every stage of a plan succeeded. He stole a crown from a god, framed an innocent man for the theft, sent the two people most capable of stopping him on an errand from which no sea creature had ever returned, walked across an empty road and took the formula, distributed mind control helmets to an entire city, and renamed the city after himself. He held all of it for the length of a feature film and was stopped not by any flaw in the plan, but by moisture hitting a fan switch on a shelf in a gift shop on the surface of the water. Plan Z was described by Plankton himself as lemon-scented. This is a reference the show had planted earlier, in a Mermaid Man episode where the acronym EVIL was decoded to stand for Every Villain is Lemons. Plankton had apparently designed Plan Z with enough deliberateness to include a fragrance. That detail is small, but it says something about how different this plan was from everything that preceded it. He had thought about it thoroughly enough to choose a scent. It was the last plan in his filing cabinet, the one he had never opened, the one Karen pointed out while he was complaining about having exhausted everything from A to Y. He retrieved it from the back of the drawer, read it, and experienced something he rarely felt: confidence that was proportionate to the actual quality of what he was holding. The plan had 4 stages, and each one had to succeed before the next could begin. The first was theft from a god. King Neptune, the divine ruler of the ocean and the most powerful individual in Bikini Bottom's cosmology, possessed a crown that was both his symbol of authority and a personal necessity. Neptune was bald, concealing this fact from his subjects behind the crown at all times, and the crown's loss would not simply be a political embarrassment. It would be a personal catastrophe that would send him into a state of uncontrollable fury. Plankton flew to Neptune's palace, entered the throne room while Neptune was distracted by a lesson he was delivering to his daughter Mindy about the nature of royal power, and took the crown from Neptune's head while the king's attention was elsewhere. Neptune did not notice immediately. By the time he looked for the crown, it was gone, and Plankton was already on his way to Shell City, a location beyond the reach of most ocean creatures, where the crown would be stored until it was needed. The crown's absence destroyed Neptune's composure immediately and completely. He was horrified, furious, and looking for someone to blame. Plankton provided the blame in advance. He had planted evidence at the crime scene, a note written in a hand designed to implicate Mr. Krabs, stating plainly that Mr. Krabs had stolen the crown and signed with Mr. Krabs' full name. He had also arranged for a phone call to be placed to Neptune's court from a voice claiming to be someone who had purchased the crown from Mr. Krabs and sold it to Shell City. The evidence was fabricated entirely. The caller was Plankton himself. But Neptune, consumed by the loss of the crown and the personal humiliation of his baldness being exposed, accepted the evidence without rigorous examination and arrived at the Krusty Krab in a state of divine rage. The second stage of the plan required Mr. Krabs to be neutralized for an extended period. Neptune froze him. Using his trident, the king encased Mr. Krabs in a block of solid ice in the middle of the Krusty Krab, threatening to execute him if the crown was not returned within 10 days. SpongeBob, arriving at that moment in a state of emotional distress about a separate professional disappointment, attempted to defend Krabs and managed only to make things worse. Neptune froze Krabs more thoroughly. SpongeBob and Patrick were dispatched on a mission to Shell City to retrieve the crown, a journey that took both of them out of Bikini Bottom for the entire middle portion of the film. Squidward, who was enjoying the unexpected time off, was not paying attention to anything that mattered. The Krusty Krab was effectively undefended. Plankton walked across the road and took the formula. The simplicity of that moment is worth sitting with. The plan that reached across multiple stages, that involved stealing from a god, manufacturing evidence, framing an innocent man for a crime committed under divine notice, and sending the 2 people most likely to stop him on an impossible errand, ultimately came down to Plankton walking across an empty road and picking up a document that nobody was there to protect. Every elaborate step of Plan Z existed to create that one moment of unguarded access. The crown theft was not about the crown. The framing of Krabs was not about Krabs. The dispatch of SpongeBob and Patrick was not about Shell City. All of it was engineering a single moment in which the road between the chum bucket and the Krusty Krab was clear, and the formula was sitting there with no one watching it. He had the formula. He had the Krusty Krab closed and its owner frozen. He had SpongeBob and Patrick somewhere between Bikini Bottom and a location from which no sea creature had ever returned. Plankton opened the chum bucket for business with one significant new addition: a line of bucket helmets available to every customer. The helmets looked like merchandise. They functioned as mind control devices. Every person who put one on became a fully obedient instrument of Plankton's will, capable of following instructions and incapable of independent thought or resistance. The customers of the chum bucket, lured across the road by the promise of Krabby Patties now being served on Plankton's side of the street, put the helmets on and joined his army. The army grew. Bikini Bottom's entire population, helmet by helmet, fell under Plankton's control. The town was renamed Planktopolis. Statues of Plankton were erected. The infrastructure of an entire community was reorganized around the preferences and ambitions of a single planktonic copepod who had been trying to steal a recipe for 25 years and had finally, through the most elaborate and carefully sequenced crime of his career, succeeded. The citizens moved through the renamed streets in their bucket helmets, following orders, unable to remember or access whatever independent lives they had been living before the helmets went on. Neptune himself eventually ended up wearing a helmet. The god who had arrived at the Krusty Krab to execute Mr. Krabs for a theft he had not committed was, by the film's third act, walking around Planktopolis in Plankton's livery, just as controlled as everyone else. The villain who had spent his entire series career being flicked across a road by a crab, who had been flushed down toilets and launched from straws and bounced off analyzer screens and squashed against concrete walls behind movie screens, had enslaved a deity. The scale of what Plan Z accomplished was not just the largest crime of Plankton's career. It was one of the largest crimes committed by any villain in the show's history, measured by the number of victims, the severity of the harm, and the completeness of the control achieved. SpongeBob and Patrick were dead, or appeared to be dead. They had reached Shell City, which turned out to be a beachside gift shop run by a human, and had been captured and nearly killed in the process of retrieving the crown. The film showed them desiccating under a heat lamp, their bodies losing moisture in a way that implied something final. Plankton, watching through a video screen in Planktopolis, saw them die and understood that his last real obstacle had been removed. He had won. The formula was his. The town was his. The god was helmeted. The fry cook and his starfish companion were dead on a shelf in a gift shop on the surface of the water. Then a tear fell. SpongeBob's tear, produced in his final moments, hit the power switch of a fan near the heat lamp. The fan activated. The moisture in the air reached them. They were not dead. David Hasselhoff was on the beach. Events unfolded from there in ways that moved faster than any summary can fully convey, ending with SpongeBob and Patrick returning to Bikini Bottom on the back of a swimmer, SpongeBob acquiring a guitar, and the helmets being destroyed through the application of a heavy metal guitar solo that shattered the control devices and freed everyone wearing them simultaneously. Plankton ordered his freed but no longer controlled former slaves to seize SpongeBob. They ran him over instead. Neptune, unhelmed and fully restored to divine fury, but now correctly informed about who had actually stolen the crown, arrested Plankton on the spot. The specific charge was turning Bikini Bottom into a living nightmare, which the film presented as a recognized legal category in Neptune's jurisdiction. Mr. Krabs was unfrozen. The crown was returned. The formula was presumably recovered, though the film does not linger on the logistics of that particular transfer. The criminal indictment from Plan Z is the longest single entry in Plankton's entire file. Theft of a divine artifact from a sitting monarch. fabrication and planting of evidence, false witness testimony delivered by telephone to the court of a god, criminal framing of an innocent person for a capital crime, given that Neptune's stated intention was execution, obtaining intellectual property through fraud, mass distribution of mind control devices to the general public without their knowledge or consent, forced labor of an entire enslaved population, forced labor and control of a head of state, criminal renaming and reorganization of a municipality, conspiracy to commit all of the above across multiple stages of a single coordinated criminal operation. Plankton was not arrested for any one of these things. He was arrested for the aggregate effect of all of them combined, which the film described simply as turning Bikini Bottom into a living nightmare, which is accurate as a summary if not precise as a legal charge. The success of Plan Z, however temporary, forces a reassessment of the earlier failures. Looking back at the robots and the lawsuits and the family army through the lens of Plan Z, what becomes clear is that those schemes all shared a structural weakness. They required Plankton to directly confront the formula's guardians. Every plan that put him in the same space as Mr. Krabs or SpongeBob at the moment of the theft created a point of failure at the final stage. The formula was always defended by the people who cared most about it, and those people were always present at the moment Plankton needed them to be absent. Plan Z did not try to defeat the Guardians. It removed them entirely before the theft even began. Krabs was frozen. SpongeBob and Patrick were sent to Shell City. Squidward was distracted. The path to the formula was cleared before Plankton set foot in the Krusty Krab. That is the architectural lesson of Plan Z. The formula was never the problem. The people protecting it were the problem. Every previous scheme had tried to solve the problem at the point of theft. Plan Z solved it in advance, through 3 separate operations that each addressed one of the Guardians, leaving the formula itself undefended and available. The simplicity of the final step, walking across an empty road, was made possible by the complexity of everything that preceded it. Plankton also demonstrated something specific about his intelligence in the construction of Plan Z that his earlier schemes had not fully revealed. He understood Neptune. He understood that a god who was embarrassed about his baldness and dependent on a crown for his public dignity was a god who would not think clearly when the crown disappeared. He understood that Neptune's fury would be total and his investigation would be superficial, because fury of that magnitude does not pause to examine evidence carefully. A note and a phone call were enough, not because Neptune was stupid, but because Neptune was humiliated. And humiliation produces the kind of anger that moves fast and lands on the nearest available target. Plankton had modeled his enemy's psychology precisely enough to predict how he would respond to a specific emotional wound, and then inflicted that wound at the exact moment it would produce the reaction he needed. That level of psychological modeling was not present in the early schemes. The brain device required no understanding of SpongeBob's psychology because it bypassed psychology entirely. The robot Krabs required only enough surface-level knowledge of SpongeBob's habits to predict that he would not immediately identify the forgery. Plan Z required Plankton to understand Neptune deeply enough to predict his behavior under extreme emotional stress, and to construct a scenario that would produce that stress at a precise moment and channel it in a precise direction. The difference between the criminal who built a brain control device in Season 1 and the criminal who emotionally engineered a god in 2004 is a measure of how much Plankton had developed, even if the show rarely credited him with that development explicitly. The film was intended by Hillenburg as the series finale. Plankton's arrest at the end of it was meant to be the last image of him as a criminal, a permanent resolution to a running gag that had defined the show since its first episode. The series continued anyway, new episodes arrived, and Plankton was back at the chum bucket in subsequent seasons, without any explanation of how he had been released or what had happened to the charges Neptune had placed against him. The continuity of the show absorbed Plan Z and moved past it, treating it as one entry in a long catalog rather than the closing chapter it was designed to be. Plankton never referenced it directly in later episodes. Neither did anyone else. Planktopolis was dismantled and forgotten. The helmets were gone. The statues came down. The road between the two restaurants was the same width it had always been. But the record stands regardless of what the show chose to remember. Plan Z is the single most successful crime Plankton ever committed, measured by objectives achieved. He stole a divine artifact. He framed an innocent man for a capital offense. He obtained the formula. He enslaved an entire city, including its god. He renamed the city after himself. He held all of it for the duration of a feature film. He was not undone by his own mistakes or his own inability to resist a Krabby Patty at a critical moment. He was undone by a fan blade and a tear, and a guitarist who turned out not to be dead. The margin was that small. The plan itself was without meaningful flaw. After 25 years and more than 1,000 failed attempts, Plankton built one that worked, held the world, and lost it only because moisture hit a switch at the right moment on a shelf in a gift shop on the surface of the ocean. That is the story of Plan Z. The best day, the one that held, the one that required an act of biological improbability to undo. And the morning after, the chum bucket was still there, the road was still the same width, and Plankton was already thinking about what came next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Plan Z was the crime that actually worked, and it took a miracle to undo it. Coming up, the series returned and Plankton returned with it, and the crimes that followed were stranger, more personal, and in some cases more disturbing than anything Plan Z had required him to do. Section 7. The Stranger Crimes. After the 2004 film, the show continued without Stephen Hillenburg, who had designed it as a finished story. Plankton reappeared in the post-movie seasons without any explanation of how he had been released from Neptune's custody or what had become of the charges filed against him for turning Bikini Bottom into a living nightmare. The road was the same width. The formula was across the street. The schemes that followed were stranger and more varied than anything the earlier run had produced, and several of them were more genuinely disturbing, operating through biological invasion, identity theft at the level of a living body, and food fraud directed at the general public. Sandy Cheeks was a scientist, an inventor, and one of the most technically capable residents of Bikini Bottom. She was also a squirrel, which meant she wore a full-body pressure suit to survive underwater, and the suit's exterior was covered in fur that was part of her actual body. Plankton identified this fur as an opportunity. His plan was to steal it, construct a wearable replica of Sandy from the outside in, and use the resulting suit to walk into the Krusty Krab as Sandy, gain SpongeBob's trust through the disguise, and extract the formula. The execution required him to physically separate Sandy from her own fur pelt while she was still alive, and then wear that pelt as a costume. He did it. Sandy woke up without her fur, which left her not just cold and exposed, but visibly stripped of something that was part of her body. She moved through Bikini Bottom in this state, trying to find out what had happened, while Plankton walked around inside her skin, attempting to pass as her. The disguise was imperfect. His voice was wrong. His movements were wrong. His proportions inside the suit were wrong in ways that a careful observer would have noticed immediately. SpongeBob took longer than he should have to register that something was off. Sandy arrived at the Krusty Krab while Plankton was still inside her fur. She reclaimed the pelt. Plankton was exposed and ejected. Sandy, stripped bare, was then arrested for public indecency, which the episode treated as the comic resolution, but which represents a separate injustice. The victim of the crime suffering legal consequences, while the perpetrator was simply sent home. The criminal charges against Plankton from that episode are serious regardless of tone. He stole biological material from a living person's body, wore it, and used it to impersonate that person in a commercial context for the purpose of obtaining property. Theft of body covering, criminal impersonation, and fraud sit at the minimum of what that ledger contains. Going inside SpongeBob had been the method of Plankton's very first crime, back in Season 1, when he attached a brain control device and marched the sponge through the night streets of Bikini Bottom. The post-movie seasons returned him to that interior, but with a different objective. Rather than controlling SpongeBob's movements, Plankton was sent in by Karen, who had developed a plan to access SpongeBob's brain directly and retrieve whatever memory it contained of the Krabby Patty formula. Plankton miniaturized himself, entered SpongeBob, and navigated his internal anatomy, looking for the region of the brain where cooking knowledge was stored. He found the memory. He reached the part of SpongeBob's consciousness where the formula lived and was on the verge of extracting it when SpongeBob's internal processes ejected him. He emerged without the information he had come for. The crime was attempted neurological burglary conducted from the inside of the victim's body without consent, targeting the specific region of the victim's brain that stored the information Plankton wanted. The earlier mind control episode had operated the body from outside by attaching a device to the brain's surface. This episode sent Plankton into the brain's interior to steal a memory directly. The escalation in invasiveness between those two crimes, committed more than a decade of television apart, is a measure of how far Plankton's willingness to cross biological boundaries had traveled. Food fraud represented a different category of harm, one directed at the general public rather than at specific individuals. Plankton's initial attempt at free samples was honest in its way. He distributed actual chum and hoped people would enjoy it. They did not. The reaction was immediate and physical, and drove people away from the chum bucket faster than they had previously been avoiding it voluntarily. His second attempt was not honest. He took chum, packaged it to resemble Krabby Patties, and distributed it to the community under the false label. The community ate the disguised chum, became sick and furious, and gathered in front of the Krusty Krab, which they blamed for the illness based on the false labeling of the product they had consumed. The Krusty Krab lost business it had done nothing to lose. Plankton had committed food fraud against the general population, caused physical illness to an unspecified number of victims, and structured the fraud specifically to redirect the consequences onto a competitor. Food adulteration, false commercial labeling, distribution of harmful products, and intentional interference with a competitor's business through fraudulent means are the charges that scheme produced. Music became the vehicle for another post-movie crime that was one of the more inventive schemes of the later seasons. After breaking out of jail, which added an escape charge to whatever had put him there, Plankton began assembling a rock band. He printed t-shirts before anyone had agreed to join. The band name on those shirts was Plankton and the Patty Stealers. SpongeBob joined the band without registering the name as a warning. Patrick joined because belly drumming was a recently discovered talent. Squidward joined for the fame. The band rehearsed and prepared for a performance at the Krusty Krab, during which Plankton intended to have SpongeBob perform a song about the Krabby Patty formula that would reveal the ingredients through its lyrics. Sustaining the deception across multiple rehearsal sessions required Plankton to behave as a genuine band leader for long enough to get everyone to the performance. He had to pretend the music mattered while recording equipment sat concealed in the venue, aimed at SpongeBob waiting for him to sing the uncensored version of a formula song that Plankton had learned existed. SpongeBob sang the censored version. The equipment captured nothing useful. Plankton abandoned the musical pretense and moved directly for the formula, which SpongeBob intercepted. He was arrested again, this time with 22 years to his next gig, according to the episode's closing joke, delivered by SpongeBob from outside the jail window while the band played on. Jail escape, fraud in the formation of a commercial enterprise, deceptive recruitment of musicians under false pretenses, attempted industrial espionage through covert recording, trespass, and attempted theft are what that episode added to the record. The detail about the t-shirts is worth holding on to. Printing the band's true purpose on merchandise before anyone in the band knew what the band was actually for suggests a level of confidence in the scheme that the scheme did not earn. Plankton believed it would work thoroughly enough to brand it before execution. The t-shirts exist as physical evidence of intent, sitting in SpongeBob's and Patrick's and Squidward's drawers, somewhere in Bikini Bottom, long after the band dissolved. All four of these post-movie crimes, the Sandy fur theft, the inside job, the food fraud, and the band scheme, share a quality that distinguishes them from the earlier catalog. None of them required Plankton to be physically present in the Krusty Krab during the theft attempt. The Sandy costume was going to walk him in as someone else. The inside job was going to extract the information without any external confrontation at all. The food fraud targeted the community rather than the restaurant directly. The band scheme was going to capture the formula acoustically from a safe distance. Plankton had learned across the years that the moment of direct contact between himself and the formula was the most dangerous moment in any plan. His size, his speed, and his compulsive need to physically possess any Krabby Patty in his vicinity combined at that moment to destroy whatever careful construction had brought him there. The later schemes were attempts to reach the formula without reaching it, to extract the information through proxies and disguises and biological infiltration rather than through the direct grab that had ended every early plan the same way. The strategy was sound. The execution kept failing for reasons specific to each scheme. Sandy noticed her own fur was missing. SpongeBob's brain ejected the intruder. The food fraud was traceable back to its source. The recording equipment captured only the censored version. Each failure was different, which meant Plankton was not making the same mistake repeatedly in this period. He was making new mistakes, which is a form of learning even if the outcome remained identical. Karen was frequently the architect of the more sophisticated post-movie schemes. She analyzed the formula's defenses, modeled SpongeBob's behavior, and proposed approaches that Plankton would then execute in the field. The inside job had been her plan. Several other schemes from the later seasons originated with her data analysis rather than with Plankton's instinct. This created a dynamic where the criminal intelligence driving the Chum Bucket operation was increasingly distributed between two people, one of whom had processing power and strategic patience, and the other of whom had the physical mobility to go where the plan required. What the later seasons did not change was the conclusion of each scheme. The formula stayed where it was. Plankton returned to the Chum Bucket. Whatever biological material he had stolen, whatever psychological damage he had caused, whatever food he had fraudulently distributed to whoever ate it and became ill, the net position at the end of each episode was the same as it had been on July 31st, 1999. The crimes accumulated. The result did not change. The record grew longer and stranger, and the Chum Bucket sat empty. And across the road, the Krusty Krab served Krabby Patties to a line of customers that never seemed to shorten, indifferent to everything that had been done in pursuit of the recipe that made them possible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The stranger crimes of the later seasons pushed Plankton into biological and psychological territory he had never entered before. Coming up, the show turns its attention back on its own villain, and the crimes being committed are not always his. Section 8. What the show did to its own villain. SpongeBob SquarePants premiered in 1999 and became one of the most watched children's programs in television history within its first 2 seasons. By the mid-2000s, it was a cultural fixture, generating merchandise revenues in the billions, and maintaining a viewership that spanned age groups in a way that few animated series managed. The show's creator, Steven Hillenburg, had designed it with specific intentions about tone, about character, about the kind of comedy it would and would not pursue. His guidelines were protective of the world he had built. Characters had defined personalities that were not supposed to drift. Relationships had internal logic that was supposed to hold. The comedy was supposed to emerge from who these people were, not from what the plot needed them to do on any given week. Hillenburg left the show after the 2004 film, which he had intended as its conclusion. Nickelodeon continued producing episodes without him, and the show ran through additional seasons under different creative leadership. Hillenburg eventually returned in 2015 and remained involved until his death in 2018 from ALS. The period between his departure and his return, roughly covering seasons 4 through 9, is the stretch of the show that fans and critics have discussed most extensively in terms of quality and tone. Some episodes from that period are considered among the best the show ever made. Others are considered among its worst, cited specifically for the treatment of characters in ways that Hillenburg's original design had not intended. Plankton sits at the center of that conversation more than almost any other character. He was always the villain, always the one being defeated, always the one returning to the chum bucket empty-handed. That was the premise, and it was understood by everyone watching. What changed in the post-movie seasons was not the outcome of his schemes, but the texture of his failure. The early seasons defeated Plankton through the resilience of the world around him. The formula was clever. SpongeBob was inadvertently competent. The Krusty Krab's defenses were eccentric but sufficient. Plankton lost because his plans met a world that resisted them. The post-movie seasons introduced something different. Episodes where Plankton was not just defeated, but humiliated. Not just stopped, but broken. Not just sent home, but driven to states of genuine psychological collapse that the show then presented as comedy. The one-course meal episode is the most discussed example of this shift, and it deserves more space than a summary can provide, because the details of what happens in it are essential to understanding what the show had become willing to do to this character by season 7. Plankton attacked the Krusty Krab with explosives at the start of the episode. He captured SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs in a machine. He was on the verge of extracting the formula's location when Pearl arrived in the kitchen. Her size and species triggered something in Plankton that had not been a part of his established character. A genuine, total, irrational fear of whales. He ran. Mr. Krabs observed the fear response and began constructing a plan that had nothing to do with protecting the formula. He borrowed a dress from Pearl. He built a costume. For the next 16 days, he appeared at the chum bucket, at the windows and through the doors and in Plankton's dreams, wearing the Pearl disguise and claiming to want to eat him. Plankton boarded up his windows. The costume got through. He barricaded his door. The costume appeared inside anyway. He tried to reason with what he believed was Pearl. The costume did not respond to reason. He told Karen what was happening. Karen told him there were no whales in the chum bucket. The costume kept appearing. For 16 continuous days, Plankton lived inside a sustained hallucination constructed by his enemy specifically to exploit the most irrational and the most personal fear he had ever revealed. the nightmares began. He dreamed of a demonic version of Pearl, consuming him and consuming his relatives, an image the episode rendered in enough detail that the horror of it was legible even through the cartoon format. He woke from those nightmares into an environment where the thing he was dreaming about kept materializing. The boundary between the nightmare and the waking experience collapsed. Plankton stopped being able to function. He stopped going to the Krusty Krab. He stopped scheming. He stopped doing anything except trying to survive inside his own building, and eventually he stopped being able to do that either. He walked out of the chum bucket and lay down in the road. He positioned himself in the path of a bus with the specific intention of being run over by it. SpongeBob found him there and understood what he was looking at. He went to Mr. Krabs and asked him to stop. Krabs refused. He reminded SpongeBob that Plankton had revealed the formula's location earlier in the episode, which he framed as justification for what he was doing, as though the partial compromise of a recipe was a proportionate reason for 16 days of deliberate psychological destruction of another living being. SpongeBob did not accept this logic, but also did not have the means to force Krabs to stop. What SpongeBob did instead was tell Plankton the truth. He went back to the road, told Plankton that the Pearl figure had been Mr. Krabs in a costume the entire time, and watched Plankton's response shift from suicidal despair to something colder. Plankton got up. He hired a mime. He sent the mime to torment Mr. Krabs with whatever Krabs' equivalent phobia was, which the episode revealed to be mimes. The equilibrium of mutual harassment was restored. SpongeBob then drove Plankton away from the formula with holographic whales, released Mr. Krabs from the mime, and the episode ended with the mime still bothering Krabs as the credits approached. The episode's criminal ledger from Plankton's side includes the opening bomb attack, the machine capture of SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, the attempted formula extraction, and the hiring of a mime as a harassment instrument. These are real crimes, and they sit on the record. But the episode is remembered and has been discussed in critical terms for over a decade, primarily because of what Mr. Krabs did in response. 16 days of targeted psychological torture, using a known phobia as the weapon, with the explicit aim of destroying his enemy's mental stability, followed by a refusal to stop, even when confronted by a third party about the harm being caused. The show presented Krabs throughout this as a protagonist. His harassment was framed as funny. Plankton's suffering was the source of the humor. The episode did not suggest that what Krabs was doing was wrong. It suggested, through its structure and its resolution, that Plankton had it coming. This framing matters to any complete account of Plankton's criminal record, because it contextualizes the crimes he committed in that episode and in the surrounding seasons. The show that aired Plankton's army recruiting criminals at a nightclub in Season 3 and played it as a funny sequence about a desperate villain grasping for resources, had by Season 7 developed a willingness to push Plankton into states of genuine psychological crisis and present those states as entertainment. The character had not changed in ways that justified the treatment. His crimes were the same crimes, the same theft attempts, the same formula obsession, the same physical restraint of employees with machines. What changed was the show's appetite for showing consequences to him that went beyond simple defeat. The broader fan and critical conversation about this period of the show has produced something like a consensus. The post-Hillenburg seasons, particularly seasons 6 and 7, treated Plankton more harshly than the character's established nature warranted, and in ways that Hillenburg's design had not intended. When Hillenburg returned in 2015, the show's tone shifted again. Plankton, in the later Hillenburg-adjacent seasons, was allowed to be funny without being broken. His schemes were ambitious again. His relationship with Karen became a genuine source of warmth in episodes that the early seasons had only gestured toward. The show remembered that he was a villain meant to be lovable in his awfulness, not a target meant to be destroyed for the audience's amusement. Plankton's relationship with Karen across the full run of the series is itself a subject that the criminal focus of this analysis has not fully addressed, and it carries its own criminal dimension. Karen is a sentient computer. She is Plankton's wife. She is also, depending on the episode, his most consistent accomplice, his most reliable critic, and the person in Bikini Bottom who understands him most completely. She designs schemes for him. She analyzes the formula's defenses. She tells him when his plans are bad. She also, in the 2025 Netflix film, reaches a breaking point of her own. The film, Plankton the Movie, released on Netflix in March 2025, gave Karen the kind of narrative space she had never had in the series proper. Plankton's opening scheme failed, as it always did. He returned to the chum bucket to find that Karen had converted the restaurant into a successful Mexican-themed establishment with actual customers, a creative and commercial instinct that had produced exactly what Plankton claimed to want, a profitable chum bucket. His response was to burn it down. He did not like that the success was Karen's idea rather than his. He did not like that the restaurant's identity had changed without his direction. He destroyed what she had built because it did not match his specifications for what success was supposed to look like. Karen removed her empathy chip. Without it, she became something different and considerably more dangerous than the computer who had spent decades helping a tiny villain fail at restaurant theft. She built a mech. She began extracting metal from Bikini Bottom's infrastructure to construct a floating fortress. She moved toward the surface with the intention of taking over the world, a goal she pursued with an efficiency and a scale that Plankton had never approached in any of his own schemes. The film then required Plankton to team up with SpongeBob, Pearl, Sandy, and Mrs. Puff to stop her, which positioned the show's most committed criminal as the hero of his own story for the first time in the franchise's history. The crimes Plankton committed at the start of the film, before Karen's transformation, included the standard formula theft attempt and the destruction of Karen's restaurant. The destruction of the restaurant is a crime the film treated as a character flaw rather than a legal matter. A moment of petty cruelty directed at a spouse whose success threatened his ego. But it was also arson. Plankton burned down a building. He burned down his own building, which complicates the arson charge in jurisdictional terms. But Karen's restaurant was inside it, and Karen had built it, and destroying it was an act of deliberate property destruction motivated by jealousy. The film used it as character establishment rather than criminal documentation, but the fire was real within the story's logic. What the film gave Plankton, beyond the heroic positioning, was a backstory for his relationship with Karen that reframed the entire history of their partnership. The origin of how they met, how she became his wife, what she had meant to him across all those years of failed schemes and empty restaurants and roads that never got any narrower, was delivered in a way that made the criminal career look different in retrospect. Not justified, not excused, but situated inside a life that had more emotional content than the series alone had suggested. Plankton had always been lonely. Karen had always been the one presence in his life that was permanent, inconsistent, and not an enemy. The film asked what happened when that presence was pushed past its limit, and then asked Plankton to repair what his own behavior had broken, which was a more demanding task than stealing a recipe had ever been. The show, across its full run from 1999 to the present, had done something unusual with its villain over time. It had made him sympathetic without making him innocent. It had given him warmth without excusing the crimes. It had allowed him to be broken by the show's own treatment of him, and then recovered him when that treatment became untenable. It had taken him from a debut in which he committed neurological assault for the first time in children's television, and arrived 26 years later at a Netflix film in which he saved the world from his own wife and chose her over the formula for the first time in his fictional life. The criminal record did not change. The context around it did. That contextual shift is what makes Plankton's criminal career more interesting than a simple list of offenses would suggest. He committed every crime on the record with complete intent and without visible remorse. He also committed them from a position of genuine deprivation, genuine loneliness, and genuine conviction that the formula was the thing standing between him and the life he deserved. Those two things are both true simultaneously. The crimes were real. The deprivation was real. The show held both of those facts without resolving the tension between them, which is a more sophisticated thing to do with a cartoon villain than the genre typically attempts. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show's treatment of its own villain shifted across the decades, from lovable menace to broken target and back again. Coming up, the crimes that came from the courtroom, the jail cell, and the road between the two restaurants, and what Plankton's full arrest record actually looks like when assembled in one place. Section 9. The Arrest Record. The Bikini Bottom jail processed Plankton often enough that by the time a Season 9 episode centered on his incarceration, the prison staff knew him by number. That number was 655321, a reference the show embedded without explanation, printed on a standard issue uniform, and assigned to a cell that the warden showed a new recruit on his first day as a point of institutional orientation. Plankton was not presented as an unusual inmate. He was presented as a recurring one, a fixture of the facility, in the same way the chum bucket was a fixture of the street it sat on. He went in, he came out. He went back in. The cell changed sometimes. The number did not. The specific architecture of his incarceration history matters because it reveals something about how Bikini Bottom's legal system actually processed him. He was not held. He was filed. Whatever sentence was assigned after any given arrest was short enough or porous enough that Plankton was back at the chum bucket in subsequent episodes without any visible period of genuine rehabilitation or any meaningful disruption to his planning. The jail was a pause in the criminal career rather than an interruption of it, and the show treated it with roughly the same attitude Plankton brought to his other temporary defeats, something to move through on the way to the next attempt. The jailbreak episode from Season 9 placed him inside long enough to study the facility and organize a coordinated operation. Plankton was serving whatever sentence had followed his most recent arrest when SpongeBob arrived at the prison for a weekend shift. Mr. Krabs had arranged for SpongeBob to work at the jail on weekends, specifically to watch Plankton, which tells you something about how seriously Krabs took the possibility of Plankton getting free time and using it productively. SpongeBob's presence in the jail yard gave Plankton immediate access to the one person in Bikini Bottom most likely to accidentally provide useful information, and he spent the episode recruiting from the available prison population rather than planning a conventional escape. His cellmates had their own criminal skill sets, and Plankton assembled them the way he had assembled his family in Season 3. By offering a reward proportionate to what they wanted and asking for cooperation in exchange. The target was not freedom from jail, but access to the Krusty Krab, which was a different objective and required a different kind of breach. The team organized. The operation moved. SpongeBob, who had overheard the planning from outside the cell, warned Mr. Krabs in time to prepare a defense. The formula was not taken. Plankton was returned to his cell, His number went back on the uniform, and the facility demonstrated once again that it was capable of containing him only until he decided the containment was no longer useful. The new Leaf scheme required a different kind of patience than anything the jailbreak had demanded. Plankton announced that he was giving up evil. He converted the Chum Bucket into a gift shop, filled it with trinkets and souvenirs, and presented himself to Bikini Bottom as a reformed character who had stepped away from decades of criminal activity to pursue honest retail commerce. Mr. Krabs was suspicious from the moment the sign went up. SpongeBob was willing to consider the possibility of genuine change. The community settled somewhere between those two positions, cautiously interested in the spectacle of a known villain attempting to sell merchandise. Krabs visited repeatedly looking for the deception. He found none. The gift shop was a gift shop. Plankton was behind the counter, selling things. Whatever Krabs expected to discover during his inspections, the exterior of the operation was clean enough to withstand scrutiny. He eventually extended what appeared to be genuine goodwill, and the two of them shared a moment of apparent reconciliation that the episode allowed to breathe longer than most of their interactions ever did. Krabs reached into what he understood to be a going-away present from Plankton, a gesture of friendship offered on the occasion of their peace, and found the Krabby Patty formula inside. Plankton had spent the full length of the episode building toward that single moment. The gift shop was a stage. The reformed villain persona was a sustained performance designed to get Mr. Krabs close enough and trusting enough to accept a gift without examining it first. The formula in the box was the payoff of a long con that required weeks of actual retail work, and the successful suppression of every visible indication of his real intentions across dozens of customer interactions and multiple inspections by a suspicious man who was looking specifically for the fraud. The formula in the box turned out to be a fake, which Krabs had prepared in anticipation of exactly this possibility. Plankton had deceived Krabs. Krabs had outdeceived him. The real formula remained where it had always been, and Plankton walked out of the gift shop without it, having invested weeks of commerce and performance into an outcome that produced nothing. Sustained public deception regarding criminal reformation, fraud through the presentation of false merchandise as a legitimate business operation, and attempted theft through the mechanism of a booby-trapped gift are what that episode added to the record. The gift shop itself was not illegal. Everything surrounding it was. The Spongicus scheme demolished the Chum Bucket entirely, which was the most dramatic piece of self-inflicted property destruction in Plankton's career. He cleared the land, constructed a Roman Colosseum in its place, and announced free gladiatorial entertainment for all of Bikini Bottom. The offer was genuine in its surface structure. The show was free, the spectacle was real, and the Colosseum attracted a large audience from across the community. What the audience did not know was that the gladiatorial program was designed to rout people away from the Krusty Krab by making the Colosseum the most compelling entertainment option in the area. Krabs, unwilling to lose his customer base to free admission, followed them in. SpongeBob followed Krabs. The formula was theoretically accessible while the Krusty Krab sat empty and its staff watched lions. The plan did not produce the formula. The Colosseum was eventually abandoned and the Chum Bucket was rebuilt. But the demolition of his own restaurant as a strategic maneuver is a crime against his own property that also constituted public nuisance and the construction of an unlicensed gladiatorial entertainment venue. That Plankton was willing to destroy the building he lived and worked in as a single move in a longer game is a measure of how completely the formula occupied his priorities. The Chum Bucket was expendable. The formula was not. Grandma's secret recipe placed him inside a disguise unlike any he had previously deployed. Plankton, dressed as SpongeBob's grandmother, arrived at SpongeBob's house and inserted himself into the domestic environment as a trusted family member in order to work his way toward the formula through the warmth SpongeBob extended unconditionally to elderly relatives. The disguise required him to perform grandmotherliness convincingly enough that SpongeBob, whose relationship with his actual grandmother had been established in earlier episodes as a source of genuine affection and nostalgia, did not question the substitution. SpongeBob extended to the disguised Plankton the same uncomplicated love he gave the real thing. Plankton received cookies. He received knitting lessons. He was welcomed into a domestic routine that he was using entirely as cover for an information extraction operation. The scheme failed when his identity was discovered, and he was expelled from the house without the formula. Impersonation of a family member for the purpose of gaining access to restricted property information, perpetrated against a victim whose trust in the impersonated category was total and unconditional, is what that crime was. The specific choice of target, the decision to weaponize something SpongeBob held without any skepticism at all, is consistent with the pattern visible across every manipulation crime in the record. Plankton identified what a person trusted most completely and constructed his deception around that trust precisely because total trust was the least defended entry point available. Plankton's old chum solved a waste disposal problem through criminal misdirection. His usual dumping location for rotten chum had reached capacity, and he had a surplus that needed to go somewhere. He found SpongeBob and told him that the chum was something valuable that needed to be hidden in various locations around the city, for reasons that SpongeBob accepted without requiring explanation. SpongeBob then distributed rotten chum throughout Bikini Bottom, placing it in locations that ranged from public spaces to private residences, believing he was helping with something legitimate. The city was subjected to the smell and the biological contamination of rotten chum deposited throughout its infrastructure by someone who had been manipulated into doing the depositing by the person responsible for the contamination in the first place. Illegal waste disposal, environmental contamination of public and private spaces, and the use of a third party as an unwitting instrument of that contamination are what that scheme produced. SpongeBob performed the physical acts. Plankton designed and directed them, which makes him the principal in the operation regardless of who was observed carrying the chum through the city's streets. The Patrick Conscience scheme was one of the more direct manipulations of a secondary character in Plankton's catalog. Patrick Star was not a target Plankton engaged with frequently, presumably because Patrick's interior logic was difficult to predict and therefore difficult to exploit in a reliable way. The scheme required Plankton to convince Patrick that he was his conscience, speaking to him from inside his head, guiding him toward decisions that Patrick would interpret as his own moral impulses. The decision Plankton needed Patrick to arrive at, through this guided internal voice, was to walk into the Krusty Krab and take a Krabby Patty without paying for it, which Patrick would then deliver to Plankton on the grounds that his conscience had told him it was the right thing to do. The plan exploited Patrick's genuine goodwill and his general willingness to accept whatever his internal experience told him about the world. Patrick did not have a sophisticated framework for distinguishing between an actual conscience and a tiny planktonic organism whispering directions from somewhere near his ear. The scheme moved further than many of Plankton's manipulations before it collapsed, which made it one of the more effective deployments of psychological targeting in the criminal record. The charge was fraud through impersonation of a moral faculty, which is not a category that most legal systems have written specific statutes for, but the intent and the mechanism were clear, regardless of the available legal language. Bucket Sweet Bucket redirected SpongeBob and Patrick's labor toward the Chum Bucket's renovation through misdirection about what they were actually doing and why. Plankton needed the Chum Bucket improved. Renovation cost money, and the Chum Bucket did not generate money. He directed SpongeBob and Patrick to perform the work without their understanding that the beneficiary was Plankton rather than anyone who had legitimately employed them. While they worked, he crossed the road and attempted to access the formula. The theft failed. The chum bucket had been partially renovated at no cost to Plankton. The charges include fraudulent procurement of unpaid labor through misdirection and attempted theft of the formula during the window of distraction created by that misdirection. Assembled across the full span of the series, the arrest record and the associated scheme history describe a criminal operation that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more varied than the show's comedy framing ever required it to be. Plankton was not just a villain who tried the same thing repeatedly and failed repeatedly. He was a criminal who exhausted one category of approach, developed a new one, exhausted that, and kept going. The jail documented the failures. The schemes documented the persistence and the range. Neither the cell nor the defeats changed the calculation he ran every time he looked out the chum bucket window. The legal system of Bikini Bottom processed him and released him and processed him again without any visible effect on the underlying behavior. This is partly because the show needed him available for the next episode, but it also reflects something true about how the criminal record functions within the story's logic. Plankton was not committing crimes because he lacked better options in a conventional sense. He was committing them because the formula was the only resolution he had ever been able to imagine for the problem that defined his life, and no amount of jail time was going to change the nature of that problem. The cell was temporary. The problem was not. The full record, from the brain device in 1999 to the waste disposal scheme and the Patrick conscience manipulation and the grandmother disguise, describes a career that spanned more than 2 decades of television and covered categories of crime that ranged from neurological assault to food fraud to gladiatorial real estate development. The number of victims was large. The duration of the operation was extraordinary. The consistency of the objective across every scheme, getting the formula, getting what Plankton believed was owed to him, never wavered, regardless of what approach he tried or how completely it failed. What the record does not contain is a single moment where Plankton considered stopping. The 1,000 attempts documented in the anniversary special were not presented by the show as a sign of pathology or as evidence that the goal was unreachable. They were presented as a number. Plankton acknowledged the number and kept going. The jail acknowledged the number by assigning him a permanent prisoner ID. The Krusty Krab acknowledged it by hiring SpongeBob to watch him on weekends. Everyone in Bikini Bottom had incorporated Plankton's persistence into the baseline of how their world worked, including Plankton himself. The attempts were not going to stop. The formula was not going to move. The road was not going to get any narrower. All of that was fixed. And within that fixed world, Plankton's criminal career was simply the ongoing fact of a particular organism's relationship to a particular piece of intellectual property, documented across more episodes of television than almost any other recurring premise the show had ever built. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The arrest record is long, and the jail could never hold him for long. Coming up, the final question the criminal file raises. Not what Plankton did, but what the complete record reveals about why he never stopped doing it. Section 10. What the formula was always about. Plankton tried to steal the Krabby Patty secret formula over 1,000 times. That number comes from the show itself, from the 10th anniversary special Truth or Square, where the count of failed attempts was placed on screen as a canonical fact. The number was already past 1,000 in 2009, which means the total across the full run of the series, through the later seasons and the films and the decades of television that followed, is considerably higher. Nobody has produced a definitive final count because the attempts are not always cleanly bounded. Some episodes contain multiple distinct schemes within a single runtime. Some schemes span multiple episodes. Some failures happen off-screen and are referenced in passing. The 1,000 is a floor rather than a ceiling, and the actual number of times Plankton looked across the road and decided today was the day, is a number that resists any neat accounting. The size of that number is the starting point for any serious attempt to understand what the formula actually meant to him. A person who tries something 1,000 times and fails every time and does not stop is not operating on commercial logic. Commercial logic contains a feedback mechanism. You try something, it fails. The failure informs the next decision, and at some point, the decision is to stop. Plankton adjusted constantly, building new machines and new disguises and new legal strategies and new approaches that covered biological invasion, psychological manipulation, geological sabotage, and dimensional switching. But the objective never changed, and the failure never produced anything resembling a genuine recalculation of whether the objective was worth the cost of pursuing it. That kind of persistence, sustained across more than 2 decades of television, points towards something operating below the level of strategy, something that is not really about the recipe at all. The stated reason for the theft campaign was always commercial. The formula would allow the chum bucket to produce Krabby Patties. Krabby Patties would attract customers. Customers would generate revenue. Revenue would make Plankton's restaurant competitive with the Krusty Krab and eventually put Mr. Krabs out of business entirely. The economic logic holds in its basic structure. A restaurant that sells food people want to eat will outperform a restaurant that sells food nobody can tolerate. And the chum bucket's fundamental problem was its product. The formula would fix the product. The fix would fix everything. The problem with this explanation is that Plankton had other ways to fix the product that he never seriously explored. His engineering capabilities were extraordinary by any measure available within the show's world. He built robots sophisticated enough to pass as specific individuals. He built brain control devices capable of operating living organisms remotely. He built dimension switching machines, geological drilling submarines, and a mind control helmet system capable of processing an entire city's population simultaneously and holding it under control for the duration of a feature film. A person with that level of technical capability could have developed an original food product through direct research and experimentation rather than spending decades attempting to steal someone else's recipe. The resources were there. The intelligence was there. The effort required to build a mind control helmet that worked on a god was almost certainly greater than the effort required to develop a genuinely edible chum dish from scratch. Karen's analytical tools were sophisticated enough to break down food at a molecular level. She successfully extracted what she believed was the formula on at least one occasion, treating it as a gift for Plankton on their wedding anniversary. The show handled this as a near miss rather than a resolution, which suggests that even functional access to the formula's contents was not actually what Plankton was after. The Plankton's regular episode confirmed this from a different angle. The chum bucket acquired a single genuine customer in that episode, someone who ate there every day and appeared to enjoy the food. One happy regular was enough to visibly destabilize Mr. Krabs. The commercial problem was solvable. Plankton did not solve it. He went back to the formula because the formula was the only solution that had ever felt like the right one. Understanding why requires going back further than most analyses of Plankton's criminal career tend to go. Back to the episode that finally gave the rivalry its origin and gave the formula its actual weight. Friend or Foe aired in Season 5 and spent most of its runtime in flashback, showing the version of events that both Mr. Krabs and Plankton carried about how their friendship ended and why. They had been children together, 2 kids from poor backgrounds who had been bullied and had found each other through shared marginalization. They worked in the kitchen of a soda shop owned by Old Man Jenkins, who treated them badly and paid them less than they were worth, and they spent that time dreaming of a restaurant that would change their lives. They tried to build a food product together. They failed repeatedly, producing things that made people ill, until a moment of accident produced something that worked. Ingredients fell from a shelf into a batter. Whatever landed in that pot became, eventually, the Krabby Patty. Then they fought over it. The fight was about credit, about who deserved ownership of something they had arrived at together through accident. Plankton left with the bottom half of the recipe, the part that read, "and a pinch of chum." Krabs stayed with the full thing, built the Krusty Krab around it, and became Bikini Bottom's most successful restaurateur. Plankton built the Chum Bucket directly across the road and looked at that success every day for the rest of his life. Whether Krabs took more than he was entitled to, whether the accident of the falling shelf gave him a recipe that had as much of Plankton in it as it had of him, whether the childhood friendship had been unequal in ways that the adult rivalry was still paying out, none of these questions were resolved by the show. Karen's security footage showed a version of events that split the blame without clearing anyone, which is probably the most honest position available, given that both participants had been telling their own versions for so long that neither one was a reliable narrator of what had actually happened. What was established beyond dispute was that Plankton left that kitchen believing something had been taken from him, and that belief had not softened in any way across the decades since. The formula from that reading was never about the burger. It was about the fight. Getting the formula meant taking back something that Plankton believed he had contributed to and been excluded from, which meant proving that his version of events was the correct one, which meant proving that the success sitting across the road from him every day was built in part on something he had put into it and never been credited for. Theft in that framing is the wrong word for what he was doing, or at least it is not the complete word. Plankton was not after someone else's property. He was after his own contribution, which had been incorporated into someone else's property without his consent. And retrieving it required going through the person who had incorporated it. This does not excuse anything on the criminal record. The food fraud made people physically ill. The mind control enslaved a city, including its divine ruler. The fur theft stripped biological material from a living body. The 16-day psychological campaign using the Pearl costume drove Plankton into the road with the intention of being killed by a bus. The harm caused across the full span of the criminal career was real within the show's logic, and a motivation rooted in childhood grievance did not reduce that harm or make any of the victims less harmed by what was done to them. What the motivation does is explain the persistence in a way that pure villainy cannot. Villains who want power for its own sake eventually calculate whether the cost has exceeded the reward and stop. Plankton never stopped because the formula was not about power. Winning it would have meant winning an argument that had been running since he was a child. And arguments like that do not have a stopping point that cost-benefit analysis can locate. The criminal career also has to be understood in the context of what surrounded it. Plankton's daily life, from the first episode to the last available entry in the record, was a life of almost total commercial failure. The Chum Bucket had no customers. The food was inedible. The building sat across the road from one of the most successful restaurants in town, close enough that the smell of Krabby Patties was presumably detectable from his front door. He woke up every day in a restaurant that nobody came to and looked out his window at a restaurant that was full. Karen was there. She was loyal and consistent and occasionally warm and genuinely intelligent, and not always sufficient company for someone living that particular daily experience. The theft attempts were not only attempts to get the formula, they were the days on which Plankton's life had direction and purpose and the possibility of resolution. The schemes were the shape his ambition took when the commercial reality of the Chum Bucket gave it nowhere else to go. Karen's role in the full arc of the criminal career is something the series proper never addressed with the depth the 2025 Netflix film eventually provided. She was an accomplice in the formal legal sense, designing plans and providing analysis and managing communications for an ongoing criminal operation that she participated in knowingly. She was also the closest thing to a genuine relationship that Plankton had, in a life defined by isolation from everyone around him. She told him when his plans were bad. She stayed when they failed. She cataloged the results without judgment and proposed alternatives without resentment. Whatever the formula meant to Plankton, Karen was the context in which the pursuit of it happened, and that context was the most stable thing in his life. The Netflix film, released on March 7, 2025, built its central conflict around what happened when that stability broke. Plankton's opening scheme failed, as it always did. He returned to the chum bucket to find that Karen had converted the restaurant into a successful Mexican-themed establishment with actual customers, doing, through her own creativity, what Plankton had never managed through 26 years of theft. His response was to burn it down. He did not like that the success was hers. He did not like that the restaurant's identity had been changed without his direction. He destroyed what she had built because the shape of the victory did not match his specifications for what winning was supposed to look like, which was a more honest portrait of his psychology than almost anything the series had produced. Karen removed her empathy chip. Without it, she became considerably more dangerous than the computer who had spent decades helping a small villain fail at restaurant theft. She built a mech from Bikini Bottom's extracted infrastructure and moved toward the surface with the intention of taking over the world, pursuing the goal Plankton had always claimed to want with an efficiency and a scale he had never approached in any of his own schemes. Plankton had to stop her. The chaos of her operation left the formula temporarily accessible during the film's middle act, and Plankton had a clear window to take it. He walked past it. He chose Karen over the formula, which was the first time in his recorded history that he made that choice, and the film treated it as the most significant act of his life. The choice did not erase the record. It did not restore the formula to the Krusty Krab, or return the crown to Neptune, or compensate the people who had eaten fraudulent chum, or explain anything to the citizens of Planktopolis about the helmets. What it revealed was something the series had always implied without making explicit. The formula was a substitute for something Plankton could not name as precisely as he could name a recipe. Karen was that thing. She had been there through every failure, and choosing her over the object of every scheme he had ever run was the closest the show came to acknowledging that the object had always been the wrong one. The formula itself, never disclosed across 26 years of television, stands as one of the great sustained mysteries in animated history. The show protected it with the same completeness that Plankton pursued it. Characters who should logically have had access to its contents were kept from them through mechanisms the show did not always bother to justify. SpongeBob cooked the patties every day and could not have articulated what was in them. Karen analyzed food at a molecular level and came close without arriving at a stable answer. The formula existed as a concept more than as a document, and its power came entirely from the secrecy that surrounded it, which meant its power depended on nobody ever fully knowing what it was. The one time the safe was opened and a recipe book was read, by Plankton's assembled family on the 25th anniversary of the first theft attempt, the contents were disturbing enough to scatter the entire army. Mr. Krabs had planted that book specifically for the occasion. The real formula, he noted afterward, was hidden somewhere he would not describe. This is the structural joke beneath the entire enterprise. The thing Plankton spent his life pursuing may not be precisely what he imagined it to be. The document that generated 1,000 crimes and a living nightmare, and a stolen divine crown, and a biological fur costume, and a fraudulent grandmother disguise, and a helmeted god, and a renamed city, was kept safe partly through security and partly through the possibility that what was most obviously protected was not the thing most worth having. Plankton never found out what it actually was. The show never told him. The audience never found out either, which placed every viewer across 26 years in exactly the same position as the show's primary villain, knowing the formula existed, knowing it mattered, and not knowing what it contained. The show made its audience share the central condition of Plankton's life, which is either an accident of long-running mystery plotting or the most precise structural joke the series ever constructed, and very likely both at once. The record closes the same place it opened, across the road from the Krusty Krab, in the building that never had customers, with the organism that was always going to try again. The jail could not hold him long enough to interrupt the planning. The defeats were processed and set aside because the alternative was accepting that the fight was finished and the wrong person had won it. And that was something his constitution would not allow. The formula stayed where it had always been, and across the road the chum bucket sat in the dark, and Plankton got up every morning and looked out the window at the building that had the thing he needed, and started working out what he had not yet tried. Every crime on the record came from that window and that morning and that look across the road. All of it. The brain device and the fake birthday and the robot and the lawsuit and the army and the enslaved city and the stolen fur and the grandmother costume and the rotten chum distributed through a city by an unwitting sponge was the accumulated output of one organism who believed he had been wronged and could not stop trying to make it right. The method was criminal. The belief underneath it was not complicated. Something had been taken. He wanted it back. He looked out the window every morning and it was still there, and so he tried again. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.